Chapter 1. The Pale Rider's Lament. The stench was the first thing that hit you in Mortarion's presence now. Not the clean, sterile smell of death that had always followed the Primarch of the Death Guard, but something far worse. Something that crawled into your lungs and stayed there, sweet and cloying and wrong. Mortarion stood at the command center's primary strategium, his gaunt frame silhouetted against the sickly green glow of tactical displays, and tried not to think about how the smell was coming from him. Lionsgate Spaceport sprawled beneath his position like a diseased organ, its landing platforms choked with the hulks of traitor vessels and the shambling forms of his sons. The Death Guard held every access corridor, every defensive emplacement, every inch of ferrocrete and plasteel that might allow the Loyalists to retake this crucial foothold. They held it all, and they held it well, because that was what Death Guard did. They endured. But the cost. Sweet throne, the cost. Mortarion's fingers, no longer quite fingers, not anymore, more like articulated bone wrapped in yellowed flesh, traced the edge of the command table. His tactical display showed scattered icons representing thousands of his sons, each one a walking testament to what he had allowed them to become. Each one a reminder of the bargain he had struck in the howling darkness between stars. "My lord," the voice came from behind him, thick with the wet breathing that all Death Guard possessed now. Captain Castode, formerly one of the finest company commanders in the Legion, now a shambling mass of corroded ceramite and suppurating flesh. The advance scouts report movement in the palace's outer districts, white scars by the look of their mobility patterns. Mortarion didn't turn. He couldn't bear to see what Castode had become, what they had all become under his leadership. Numbers? Hard to say, Lord. Perhaps 1,000, 2,000. They moved too quickly for accurate assessment. The captain's breathing hitched, and Mortarion heard the telltale rattle of fluid in damaged lungs. "Should we deploy screening elements?" The question hung in the recycled air of the command center, and for a moment Mortarion was back on Barbarous. Back in those poison mists that had shaped his youth, watching the pale overlords who commanded from their high towers while their servants writhed in the chemical fog below. He had hated them with a pure, clean fury that had sustained him through decades of war. Hated their casual cruelty, their use of forbidden arts, their willingness to twist and corrupt everything they touched in pursuit of power. Now he was one of them. The realization hit him like it did every time, a cold fist closing around something vital in his chest. He was everything he had once fought against, a sorcerer king commanding an army of the damned, wielding powers that made a mockery of the clean death he had once promised to bring to humanity's enemies. The bitter irony of it would have been amusing if it weren't so completely devastating. "My lord," Castode pressed, and there was genuine concern in that ruined voice. His sons still looked to him, still trusted him, even after what he had led them into. Especially after what he had led them into. "Deploy the 3rd and 7th companies to the primary approach routes," Mortarion said, his voice carrying the hollow resonance that had replaced his human tones. "Standard defensive posture. Let them come to us." "Acknowledged." Castode turned to relay the orders, his movements accompanied by the soft sound of decay in motion. Mortarion watched the captain leave, and tried to remember when he had stopped thinking of his sons as men, and started thinking of them as weapons. It had been gradual, he told himself, a process of necessary adaptation to their new reality. But the truth was simpler and more damning. Somewhere in the depths of the warp storm that had claimed them, he had begun to see them the way Necare had seen his subjects on Barbarous. Tools to be used, resources to be expended, lives to be sacrificed for a greater purpose. The greater purpose. That was the lie he told himself when the weight of command became too much to bear. That there was some grand design behind their suffering, some strategic necessity that justified the horror he had unleashed. But standing here in the phosphorescent glow of his command center, listening to the distant sounds of his corrupted sons moving through the spaceport's corridors, Mortarion could no longer pretend that any of this served a purpose beyond his own weakness. He had been afraid. There in the warp storm, watching the flesh of his sons bubble and slough away under the effects of that impossible plague, he had been terrified. Not of death. Death was familiar, comfortable even, but of failure, of watching his legion die while he stood helpless to save them. So when the offer had come, whispered through the screaming winds of the immaterium in a voice like autumn leaves and gentle rain, he had listened. "I can save them," the voice had said. "I can make them strong. All I ask is that you kneel." And he had knelt. The Primarch who had sworn never to bow to any power, who had built his entire identity around resistance to tyranny and corruption, had knelt in the darkness and begged a demon god to save his sons. The fact that it had worked, that Nurgle's gifts had indeed preserved the Death Guard in their own twisted way, only made the betrayal worse. A chime from the tactical display drew his attention back to the present. New movement markers appeared on the strategic overlay. Rapid advancement along 3 separate vectors, all converging on Lion's Gate's primary defensive positions. The White Scars were coming, and they were coming fast. Mortarion studied the pattern of their approach and felt something like recognition stir in the depths of his changed mind. This wasn't a reconnaissance in force or a probing attack. This was a spearhead strike, precise and surgical, designed to reach a specific objective with maximum speed and minimum exposure. The kind of assault you launched when you knew exactly what you were after and were willing to pay any price to get it. They were coming for him. The thought should have brought anticipation, even excitement. A chance to test his new powers against one of his brothers, to prove that the bargain he had struck had been worth the price. Instead, Mortarion felt only a deep, bone-tired weariness. How many of his sons would die defending him? How many white scars would fall to the rotting blades of warriors who had once been their sworn brothers? He flexed his fingers again, watching the way the yellowed bone showed through gaps in his flesh. Once, these hands had been tools of healing as much as destruction. On Barbarous, before the coming of the Emperor, he had been known as much for the lives he saved as the enemies he killed. Now they were instruments of pestilence, spreading decay with every touch. The irony was perfect, really. He had rejected the Emperor's offer of aid in defeating Nekere, insisting that he could handle his own world's problems without help. Pride, the Emperor had called it, and perhaps the Emperor had been right. But this time, when his sons had been dying and he had the chance to save them, he had swallowed his pride and accepted help from a power infinitely worse than any tyrant of Barbarous. Another chime. The White Scars were accelerating, their advance elements now less than an hour from contact with his outer pickets. Soon, the killing would begin in earnest, and Mortarion would command his plague-rotten sons to spill the blood of loyalists who had done nothing worse than refuse to abandon the dream of a better galaxy. He closed his eyes and tried to remember what that dream had looked like, back when he had still been capable of dreaming. A galaxy where humanity stood free from the predations of Xenos and the corruption of chaos, where the strong protected the weak instead of preying upon them. Simple enough in concept, impossible in execution, as everything worthwhile seemed to be. When he opened his eyes again, the tactical display showed the first flickers of engagement beginning in the spaceport's outer ring. Bolter fire and the distinctive whine of Chainsward engines echoed faintly through the command center's thick walls. The battle had begun, and soon one of his brothers would come for him with violence in his heart and righteousness on his side. Mortarion straightened to his full height, feeling the corrupt armor adjust to accommodate his changed physique. Whatever he had become, whatever he had done to earn this fate, he was still a Primarch of the Legions Astartes. He would face what was coming with dignity, even if dignity was all he had left. But first, he had a war to fight, and wars, whatever else they might cost, were something Mortarion had always understood. Chapter 2. The White Scars Gambit. Jagatai Khan crouched at the edge of the observation platform, his keen eyes tracking the sickly green miasma that rolled out from Lionsgate Spaceport like a living thing. Even at this distance, nearly 3 kilometers from the outer defensive perimeter, he could smell it, the sweet stench of decay that clung to everything the Death Guard touched. It was wrong on a level that went deeper than the senses, something that made his skin crawl and his enhanced physiology recoil in instinctive revulsion. "The corruption spreads faster each hour," said Master Sagyar, the weathered face of Khan's most trusted lieutenant grim beneath his ritual scars. "Our forward scouts report that anything organic within a kilometer of their positions begins to show signs of infection within minutes of exposure." Khan nodded, without taking his eyes off the spaceport. The tactical implications were clear enough. Any prolonged engagement with Mortarion's forces would see his own warriors begin to succumb to whatever foul contagion the Death Guard carried. Speed would be essential, surgical precision paramount. Get in, eliminate the target, get out before the corruption could take hold. The target. His brother. The thought sat in his chest like a cold stone, heavy and immovable. Mortarion, the pale king of Barbarous, the steadfast lord of the Death Guard who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the Emperor's great crusade. Now a demon prince of Nurgle, commanding legions of the walking dead from the heart of Terra's most crucial strategic position. "Lord Khan?" Sagyar's voice carried the careful note it always held when he suspected his Primarch's thoughts had wandered down dark paths. "The dispositions you requested." Khan accepted the data slate without looking, his enhanced perception absorbing the tactical information in moments. 3 companies of White Scars positioned along converging approach routes, each one selected for maximum mobility and close-quarters expertise. Assault bikes and jet bikes held in reserve for rapid extraction. No heavy weapons, no siege equipment, nothing that would slow them down when speed became the difference between success and becoming another collection of plague-rotten corpses. "You're planning to go in personally." It wasn't a question. Sagyar had served with Khan long enough to read the signs. "The Death Guard will not break for anyone else," Khan said, finally turning from his study of the spaceport. "Their loyalty to Mortarion runs deeper than their corruption. Remove him, and the entire position collapses. And if the corruption takes hold before you can reach him?" Khan met his lieutenant's gaze steadily. They both knew the answer to that question. If the Warhawk of Chogoris fell to Nurgle's rot, the White Scars would do what they had always done. They would ride on without him, carrying his memory as they carried the scars of every battle they had ever fought. "Then you extract what remains of our forces and report to Lord Dawn," Khan said. "The siege continues." Sagyar's expression didn't change, but Khan caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Good. A warrior who felt nothing at the prospect of his Primarch's death was either a liar or a psychopath, and Khan had no use for either. "There may be another way," Sagyar said carefully. "The salamanders have developed incendiary compounds that might clear the corruption without requiring close engagement. Or we could request orbital bombardment, level the entire— No. Khan's voice carried a finality that ended the discussion. This is not a strategic problem to be solved with firepower. This is a brother who has fallen, and brothers do not die alone. The words hung in the air between them, and Khan saw understanding dawn in Sagyar's scarred features. This wasn't just about retaking Lionsgate spaceport, wasn't just another objective in the grinding hell of the siege of Terra. This was about the man Mortarion had been, and the debt Khan owed to that memory. He had known Mortarion for over 2 centuries, had fought beside him on a dozen worlds during the Great Crusade. The Lord of the Death Guard had been grim company, taciturn and moody, but there had been something deeply honest about him that Khan had respected. Where other Primarchs schemed and politicked, Mortarion had simply done what needed doing, no matter how unpleasant or thankless the task. Khan remembered Galaspia, where Mortarion's forces had spent 3 months grinding through entrenched Xenos positions that no other legion could crack. Not because the Death Guard were better fighters, though they were certainly good enough, but because they were willing to pay prices that others would have found unacceptable. They endured, and they made their enemies pay for every meter of ground in blood and suffering. That was the Mortarion Khan remembered. A Primarch who took the hard assignments and saw them through, who never asked his sons to do anything he wouldn't do himself, who carried the weight of necessary evils so that others could keep their hands clean. A good man in an ugly galaxy, doing ugly work because someone had to. Now that same determination, that same willingness to sacrifice, had been turned toward ends that would have horrified the man Mortarion used to be. The reports from across the siege lines told a story written in corruption and decay. Death Guard forces spreading plague, not just as a weapon of war, but as a gift they seemed to genuinely believe they were offering. They had become missionaries of rot, spreading Nurgle's blessings with the fervor of true believers. "He chose this," Sagyar said quietly, reading the direction of Khan's thoughts. "Whatever he was before, whatever debt you feel you owe him, he made his choice when he knelt to the plague god." Khan turned back toward the spaceport, watching the green miasma pulse and writhe in patterns that hurt to follow. Did he? Or did the choice make him? It was a question that had haunted Khan since the first reports of the Death Guard's corruption had reached him. Mortarion's hatred of psychers and sorcery had been legendary, a defining characteristic that shaped everything from his legion's recruitment to his political positions within the Crusade hierarchy. For such a man to embrace demonic power seemed impossible, a contradiction so fundamental that it suggested external coercion rather than voluntary corruption. But the reports were clear, confirmed by multiple sources, and reinforced by direct observation. Mortarion commanded his daemon legions with the same grim competence he had once brought to conventional warfare. He wielded sorcerous powers that would have made him sick to contemplate in his former life. He had become, in every measurable way, exactly the kind of being he had once sworn to destroy. "The bikes are ready," Sagyar reported, checking his chronometer. "All companies report green status. We can begin the assault on your word." Khan looked out at the corruption spreading from Lion's Gate one final time, then pulled on his helm and activated the comm system that would put him in direct contact with every white scar under his command. The familiar weight of leadership settled across his shoulders, the burden and privilege of sending men to die for a cause greater than themselves. "Warriors of Chogoris," he said, his voice carrying across 3 companies of the finest mounted fighters in the galaxy. "Today we ride against our own blood, against brothers who have fallen to powers beyond redemption. This brings us no joy, but it must be done. The spaceport must be retaken, the corruption contained, and those responsible brought to account. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on them all. Some of you will not ride home from this battle. That is the price of the path we have chosen, the cost of standing against the darkness. But you will ride with honor, and your names will be remembered as long as the white scars endure. For the Emperor, for Terra, for the memory of what was lost. The response came back as a single voice, 3,000 warriors speaking in unison. For the Khan! Jagatai Khan swung onto his bike and felt the familiar surge of the machine's power plant coming online. Around him, the white scars formed up in perfect attack formation, their movements synchronized by decades of training and combat experience. This was what they had been made for. The lightning strike, the surgical assault, the impossible charge that turned defeat into victory through speed and skill and sheer audacious courage. But as they raced toward Lion's Gate spaceport, engines howling in harmony, Khan couldn't shake the image of Mortarion as he had last seen him. Not the corrupted demon prince who waited for them in the spaceport's depths, but the grim, determined Primarch who had stood with them at Ulanor, watching the Emperor accept the title of War Master with the same expression he might have worn while contemplating a necessary amputation. That man was dead. Khan knew that, accepted it, would act on it. But the man that Mortarion had been deserved better than to die alone in the stinking darkness of his own making. The white scars hit the outer perimeter at full speed, bolters chattering as they carved through the first wave of Death Guard defenders. Khan led them deeper into the maze of corruption and decay, following the beacon of his own determination toward a confrontation that would end with one brother dead and the other carrying the weight of what had been lost forever. The hunt was on, and there would be no mercy at its end. Only the clean death that Mortarion had once promised to bring to the galaxy's enemies, delivered now by a brother who remembered what mercy looked like. Chapter 3. Blood in the Spaceport. The first thing Khan learned about fighting the corrupted Death Guard was that they didn't die properly. His chain blade carved through the torso of what had once been a legionnaire, splitting ceramite and flesh in a spray of yellowed bone and putrid fluid. The blow should have been instantly fatal, would have been fatal against any normal Astartes. Instead, the Plague Marine took another step forward, his ruined chest cavity still pumping diseased blood, and swung his own weapon in a clumsy but determined arc that Khan barely avoided. It took 3 more strikes to finally put the thing down, and even then Khan wasn't entirely certain it was dead rather than simply too damaged to continue fighting. Around him, the white scars were learning the same lesson in their own brutal fashion, their usual tactics of swift, precise strikes proving inadequate against enemies who could shrug off wounds that would cripple or kill normal space marines. "My lord!" Sagyar's voice crackled through the comm as Khan finished dismembering his opponent. Third Squad reports heavy casualties on the northern approach. The enemy is using some kind of gas weapon. Our filtration systems are being overwhelmed. Khan glanced toward the northern access corridor and saw the telltale green mist rolling along the floor like a living thing. 3 white scars lay motionless in its path, their armor already showing signs of corrosion where the substance had touched it. As he watched, one of them twitched and began to rise, movements jerky and unnatural. "Fall back to secondary positions," Khan ordered, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. "Avoid contact with any atmospheric contamination. Switch to sealed system breathing apparatus." The tactical situation was deteriorating faster than his worst-case projections. What should have been a rapid strike to eliminate key leadership was turning into a grinding battle of attrition, Exactly the kind of fight the Death Guard excelled at. Khan could feel precious minutes slipping away, each one bringing his forces closer to the corruption threshold that would make extraction impossible. He needed to reach Mortarion quickly, before the spaceport became a tomb for them all. "Khan!" The voice came from ahead, distorted by Vox corruption, but unmistakably that of an Astartes officer. "Jagatai Khan of the White Scars, I would speak with you." Khan advanced cautiously, bolter ready, until he could see the source of the transmission. A Death Guard captain stood in the center of what had once been a cargo bay, surrounded by the bodies of White Scars who had tried to breach this position. His armor was a patchwork of corrosion and decay, ceramite plates held together by what looked like calcified bone growths. But Khan could still make out the company markings beneath the corruption. Gethran Morvac, former captain of the Death Guard's 7th Company. Khan had fought alongside him during the compliance of 4716, had watched him lead a disciplined assault through Xenos positions with the methodical precision that had made the 14th Legion famous. Now he stood in a pool of steaming ichor, his breathing a wet rattle through a helmet that had partially merged with the flesh of his face. "Captain Morvac," Khan said, keeping his weapon trained on the figure. "I remember you from 4716. You held the line when the Greenskins counterattacked." "I remember." The voice carried traces of the man Morvac had been, buried beneath layers of corruption, but still recognizably human. "You saved my squad that day, rode through their flank and scattered them when our ammunition ran low." "I did." "Why have you come here, Khan? Why bring your sons to die in this charnel house?" Khan studied the ruined captain, looking for any sign of the warrior he had once known. The tactical markings on his shoulder pad were still visible, though overgrown with some kind of fungal growth. His weapon, a bolter modified with what looked like biological components, was held in a professional grip, despite the apparent decay of his hands. "You know why," Khan said. "This position threatens the defense of the palace. It has to be retaken." "By whose order?" Morvac's helmet tilted slightly, a gesture so familiar that Khan felt a pang of recognition. "Dawn's? The Emperor's? Or did you simply decide that your brother needed to die?" The question hit closer to home than Khan wanted to admit. The official orders had been clear enough: retake Lion's Gate at all costs, but the personal element was undeniable. This wasn't just about strategy, it was about the man Mortarion had been, and what he had become. "He's still in there, isn't he?" Khan asked. "Your Primarch. Somewhere underneath the corruption, he's still the man who led you from Barbarous." Morvac was silent for a long moment, the only sound the wet breathing that seemed to characterize all the corrupted Death Guard. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of sorrow that transcended the physical changes wrought by Nurgle's gifts. "He is everything he ever was, and more than he ever wanted to be. The corruption didn't change him, Khan. It revealed him. Every choice, every sacrifice, every moment of despair. It's all still there, magnified and purified by the grandfather's love." "That's not love," Khan said. "That's degradation. Slavery wearing a mask of gift-giving." "Is it?" Morvac raised his weapon but didn't aim it, the gesture more contemplative than threatening. "We don't feel pain anymore, Khan. We don't fear death or suffer from despair. Our bodies are immune to poison, to disease, to age itself. What we have gained, what you have lost," Khan interrupted, "is the choice to be anything else." The words hung in the recycled air between them, carrying a finality that both warriors recognized. There would be no negotiation here, no middle ground where brothers could meet and find common cause. The corruption had progressed too far. The philosophical divide had become too wide. "I could let you pass," Morvac said quietly. one warrior to another, for the debt between us. But you would die up there, Khan. Die badly, and for nothing. The Primarch is beyond salvation now." "Perhaps," Khan said, "but he deserves the chance to choose how he faces the end. That much I owe the man he was." Morvac nodded slowly, the gesture carrying a weight of understanding and regret. "Then we are enemies again, brother. As we must be." The fight was brief and vicious. Morvac was no longer the precise tactician Khan remembered. Corruption had robbed him of some of his speed and coordination. But what he lacked in finesse, he made up for in raw durability. Khan's first strike took off his left arm at the shoulder, spraying diseased blood across the cargo bay walls. His second opened Morvac's chest to the spine, revealing organs that no longer looked entirely human. The Death Guard captain kept fighting anyway, swinging his bolter like a club with his remaining arm, trying to get close enough to grapple. It took Khan 4 more strikes to finally put him down, and even then, the corrupted Marine's fingers continued to twitch for several minutes afterward. "Forgive me, brother," Khan said to the cooling corpse. It was a prayer as much as an apology, offered to the memory of the man Morvac had been before Nurgle's gifts had transformed him into something else, entirely. Behind him, Magyar and the assault teams were securing the cargo bay and preparing for the next phase of their advance. 3 more levels to fight through, each one doubtless defended by more corrupted Death Guard, each one bringing them closer to the heart of the spaceport where Mortarion waited. Khan could feel the corruption pressing against his consciousness now, a psychic miasma that carried whispers of despair and surrender. His enhanced physiology was holding it at bay for now, but he could see the strain beginning to show in his warriors. Several of them had removed their helmets to vomit, their faces pale and drawn with the effort of resisting whatever malign influence suffused this place. "Lord Khan," one of the squad sergeants approached, his voice tight with barely controlled revulsion. "We've lost contact with 5th Squad. Last transmission was from Level 7, near the primary command center." Khan checked his tactical display and felt his jaw tighten. 5th Squad had been tasked with a flanking maneuver designed to draw defenders away from the main assault route. If they had been eliminated, it meant Mortarion was aware of the White Scar's approach and was actively responding to their tactics. The hunt was becoming a duel, and duels were something Mortarion understood very well. "Continue the advance," Khan ordered. "All squads, maintain formation and watch for ambush positions. The enemy knows we're coming now." They fought their way up through Level 6 in a running battle that left corpses scattered across every corridor. The Death Guard seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of defenders, each one more grotesquely corrupted than the last. Khan saw things that had once been space marines, wielding weapons made from their own transformed body parts, firing ammunition that looked more like spores than bullets. The worst part was the recognition. Behind every ruined faceplate, beneath every layer of decay and mutation, Khan could see traces of the warriors he had once known. Brothers who had stood with him on 100 battlefields, who had shared the fellowship of the legions during the Great Crusade's golden years. Now they were enemies, and they had to die for their mercy to be complete. By the time Khan reached Level 8, less than half his original force remained combat effective. The corruption was taking its toll, not just the physical effects of exposure to Nurgle's influence, but the psychological cost of fighting brothers who had once been loved. Several White Scars had broken under the strain, sitting in corners and weeping for warriors they had been forced to kill. But Khan pressed on, driven by something deeper than tactical necessity. Somewhere above him, Mortarion waited in the command center, surrounded by the fruits of his bargain with the plague god. The man who had once sworn to protect humanity from the predations of psychers and sorcerers now commanded legions of the damned, wielding powers that would have sickened his former self. It was time for that contradiction to end, one way or another. Khan activated his jump pack and rocketed toward the final level, leaving the grinding infantry battle behind. Speed was still his greatest advantage, and if he could reach Mortarion before the corruption claimed too many more of his warriors, they might still have a chance of completing their mission. The command center's doors loomed ahead, massive slabs of corrupted metal that pulsed with their own diseased heartbeat. Beyond them waited his brother, and the answers to questions Khan wasn't sure he was ready to ask. But ready or not, the moment of truth had arrived. Chapter 4. Face to face with decay, the command center doors parted like infected flesh, revealing the festering heart of what Lionsgate Spaceport had become. Khan stepped through the threshold and immediately understood why his warriors had been breaking down level by level. The psychic miasma here was so thick it was almost visible, a greenish haze that made the air itself seem diseased. At the center of it all stood Mortarion. Khan had prepared himself for this moment, had tried to imagine what corruption would do to the brother he remembered. The reality was worse than his darkest expectations. The Primarch of the Death Guard towered nearly 3 meters tall now, his frame stretched and elongated, like a figure glimpsed through poisoned water. What had once been pale skin was now a sickly yellow-green, mottled with patches of decay that revealed bone and sinew beneath. His face, Emperor's mercy, his face, was a ruin of exposed skull and hanging flesh, yet his eyes burned with an intelligence that was unmistakably, terrifyingly familiar. "Hello, Jagatai." Mortarion's voice was a wet whisper that somehow carried clearly across the command center. "I wondered when you would come." Khan forced himself to take another step forward, fighting against every instinct that screamed at him to flee. The smell was overwhelming, not just death, but corruption, decay given form and purpose. Breathing it felt like drowning in a septic tank. Mortarion. He kept his voice steady, professional. "You know why I'm here. To kill me, presumably." The corrupted Primarch turned from his tactical displays, movement accompanied by the wet sound of diseased flesh adjusting against rotting armor. "To put down your rabid brother before he infects anyone else. To end your suffering," Khan corrected. "The man I knew on Galaspia would have begged for death before accepting this." Mortarion was silent for a long moment, studying Khan with eyes that held depths of experience no living being should possess. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of sorrow that transcended the physical horror of his transformation. "The man you knew on Galaspia died in the warp storm between Istvan and Terra," he said. "He died watching his sons dissolve into plague-ridden madness while he stood helpless to save them. What stands before you is what was born from that death. Something stronger, something capable of protecting those who matter." Khan looked around the command center, taking in the evidence of what that protection looked like. Tactical displays showed deployment patterns for forces that no longer qualified as human. Communication arrays carried orders to spread corruption across Terra's population centers. Strategic assessments catalogued the most effective methods for breaking the loyalist defenders' morale through biological warfare. "This is protection?" Khan gestured at the displays. "You're turning Terra into a charnel house." "I'm saving it," Mortarion replied, and the sincerity in his ruined voice was somehow more horrifying than any amount of cackling villainy would have been. "Every soul touched by Nurgle's gifts becomes immune to the true horrors of this universe. No more fear, no more pain, no more despair. Only acceptance and the peace that comes with understanding one's place in the greater cycle." Khan drew his blade, the familiar weight of it helping to center him against the psychic pressure that pressed against his consciousness like a physical force. You sound like every tyrant who ever claimed to know what was best for the people they oppressed. Do I? Mortarion's own weapon materialized in his hand, no longer the simple reaping blade Khan remembered, but something organic and twisted, its edge weeping substances that steamed when they hit the deck. Or do I sound like a father who learned that sometimes love means making choices the beloved cannot understand? You sound like Nekere. The words hit Mortarion like a physical blow. Khan watched his brother's ravaged features twist into an expression of rage and anguish, so profound it transcended the physical corruption that had claimed him. "Never!" Mortarion snarled, his voice carrying harmonics that made Khan's teeth ache. "I am nothing like that poisonous wretch. Everything I have done, every sacrifice I have made, has been to spare my sons the fate he would have imposed upon them. By imposing a worse one," Khan began to circle, looking for openings in his brother's stance. Mortarion might be bigger now, probably stronger, but surely the corruption had cost him some of his speed and precision. At least Nekar never pretended his cruelty was kindness. You don't understand. Mortarion matched Khan's movement, the two Primarchs beginning the deadly dance that would end with one of them dead. You weren't there in the storm, Jagatai. You didn't watch your sons' flesh melt from their bones while they begged you to save them. You didn't feel their despair as they realized their father, their Primarch, was powerless to help. Khan thought of the corrupted death guard he had fought through to reach this place, remembering the traces of the men they had once been beneath the decay and mutation. So instead you condemned them to become walking nightmares. I made them immortal. Mortarion's scythe swept out in a vicious arc that Khan barely avoided, the weapon's edge trailing diseased vapors. They feel no pain now, fear no death, know no want or hunger or despair. What I gave them is paradise compared to what the galaxy offers to the weak and unprotected. Khan's response was to attack, his blade meeting Mortarion's scythe in a shower of sparks and psychic energy. The impact sent shockwaves through the command center, overloading several tactical displays and causing the walls themselves to crack. "Paradise?" Khan pressed forward, using his superior speed to land several quick cuts along Mortarion's flanks. None of them penetrated the corrupted Primarch's armor, but they served to drive home his point. Look at yourself, brother. Look at what you've become, and tell me this is paradise. Mortarion's counterattack was slower than Khan expected, but devastatingly powerful, the scythe's handle striking him in the ribs hard enough to crack ceramite. He rolled with the blow, coming up with his blade ready to parry the follow-up strike. What I've become is strong enough to protect those who cannot protect themselves, Mortarion said, his fighting style adapted to accommodate his changed physiology, but still recognizably his own. What you remain is a relic of a failed dream, clinging to ideals that never had any hope of surviving contact with reality. The philosophical debate continued even as they fought, each exchange of words punctuated by clashing weapons and the sound of superhuman combatants testing their limits against each other. Khan found himself falling into familiar patterns, techniques he had learned fighting alongside Mortarion during the Great Crusade, adapted now to the grim necessity of fighting against him. His brother's style had changed, become more brutal and less precise. The corruption had given him new strength and durability at the cost of the methodical precision that had once made him such a dangerous opponent. But what he lacked in finesse, he made up for in raw power, each strike carrying enough force to shatter stone and bend steel. "Do you remember, Ulanor?" Khan asked, as he ducked under another sweeping attack, his own blade opening a shallow cut along Mortarion's thigh. Standing together while the Emperor accepted the title of War Master, we believed in something then, all of us. We thought we were building something worth the cost. I remember thinking we were naive children, playing with forces beyond our comprehension, Mortarion replied, his scythe carving chunks from the deck plating as Khan danced away from its reach. I remember wondering how long it would be before reality came to collect the bill for our hubris. And now you think this is the bill? Khan gestured at the corruption surrounding them, never breaking his rhythm as he pressed his attack. You think becoming the very evil we swore to fight is somehow wisdom? I think survival is wisdom, Mortarion said. I think protecting those who depend on you is wisdom. I think accepting the universe as it truly is, rather than as you wish it could be, is the only sane response to the situation we found ourselves in. Khan could feel the corruption pressing against his defenses now, the psychic miasma of the command center, beginning to affect even his enhanced physiology. His movements were slowing marginally, his reactions becoming less precise. If this fight went on much longer, Mortarion's advantages would become insurmountable, which meant it was time to take risks. Khan feinted left, then spun right, bringing his blade up in a rising cut that should have taken Mortarion's head from his shoulders. His brother caught the strike on the haft of his scythe, then grabbed Khan's sword arm with his free hand. The contact burned. Not fire, but something worse. A cold that ate through ceramite and flesh alike. A corruption that sought to transform rather than destroy. Khan felt his armor beginning to blister and warp where Mortarion's fingers touched it. Felt alien thoughts pressing against the edges of his consciousness. Join us, brother. Let the pain end. Accept the gift. Never, Khan snarled, driving his knee into Mortarion's midsection and breaking free of his grip. The armor on his arm was ruined, the skin beneath showing early signs of infection, but his will remained his own. Then die as you lived, Mortarion said, raising his scythe for what might be the killing blow. Stubborn, prideful, and alone. Khan looked up at his corrupted brother, saw the weapon descending toward him, and felt time slow to a crawl. In that stretched moment between life and death, he found himself thinking not of tactics or survival, but of memory, of the man Mortarion had been before the corruption claimed him. The Primarch who had freed Barbarous from its poisonous overlords, the general who had led disciplined campaigns across a dozen systems, the brother who had stood with them all at Ulanor, believing in a dream of unity and progress that now lay in ruins around them. That man deserved better than this. They all did. Khan twisted away from the descending scythe, feeling its edge part the air where his head had been moments before. His own blade came up in response, angled not to kill but to disarm, seeking to create the opening he needed for the desperate gambit forming in his mind. Because looking at Mortarion now, seeing the intelligence that still burned in those corrupted eyes, Khan was beginning to suspect that his brother's greatest enemy wasn't any loyalist force. It was the horror of what he had become, and the part of him that still remembered what he had once been. The duel intensified, both Primarchs pushing themselves to their limits as the fate of Lionsgate Spaceport, and perhaps much more, hung in the balance. But the real battle, Khan was beginning to realize, wasn't the one being fought with blades and strength. It was the one being fought for the soul of a brother who might not be as lost as everyone believed. Chapter 5. The Mirror of Truth. The duel had been going for nearly an hour when Mortarion began to understand that he was going to win. It wasn't speed that would give him victory. Khan still held that advantage, his blade work a constant reminder of why the White Scars had earned their reputation as the most mobile force in the galaxy. Nor was it skill alone, though Mortarion's enhanced strength allowed him to turn what should have been glancing blows into devastating strikes that cracked ceramite and drew blood. No, what would win this fight was endurance. Mortarion could feel it in the way Khan's breathing had changed, in the slight tremor that had begun to affect his sword arm, in the microscopic delays that were creeping into his response times. The corruption that filled this command center was taking its toll, wearing down even a Primarch's legendary resilience, one breath at a time. Mortarion pressed his advantage, driving Khan back toward the chamber's outer wall with a series of powerful overhead strikes that left deep gouges in the deck plating. His scythe sang through the air with each swing, trailing streamers of diseased vapor that made the very atmosphere a weapon. "You're slowing down, brother," Mortarion said, as Khan barely managed to deflect another crushing blow. "The corruption is in your lungs now, working its way through your bloodstream. Soon your enhanced physiology will begin to fail, and then—" Khan's response was to dart forward inside Mortarion's guard, his blade carving a shallow line across the corrupted Primarch's chest. The wound began to weep immediately. Not blood, but something yellow and viscous that steamed where it hit the deck. "Then I die clean," Khan panted, spinning away from Mortarion's retaliatory strike. "Which is more than you can say." Mortarion studied his brother as they circled each other again, looking for the telltales that would signal the next attack. Khan was magnificent, even in defeat, pure, determined, uncompromising in his dedication to ideals that the galaxy had long since proven unworkable. There was something admirable about that kind of stubborn nobility, even if it was ultimately pointless. "You could accept the gifts I offer," Mortarion said, raising his scythe to block as Khan feinted high and struck low. "Join with your brothers in something greater than the failed dream we once served. There is peace in surrender, Jagatai. An end to struggle, to pain, to the constant weight of choices that have no good answers." "There is death in surrender," Khan replied, his blade work becoming more desperate as fatigue began to tell. "Death of everything that makes life worth living." "And what has life given you that was worth the price?" Mortarion's scythe caught Khan's sword in a bind, and for a moment the two weapons were locked together, bringing the brothers face to face. "Decades of war? Watching your sons die for strangers who will never know their names? Building an empire for a father who sees you as tools to be used and discarded?" Khan's answer was to break the bind and attack with renewed fury, his blade becoming a silver blur as he launched into a combination that would have overwhelmed most opponents. But Mortarion was no longer most opponents. Enhanced by Nurgle's gifts, he weathered the assault like a mountain endures a storm, absorbing damage that would have felled him in his purely human form. When Khan's attack finally spent itself, Mortarion was ready with a counterattack that sent the White Scars Primarch staggering. His scythe opened a deep gash along Khan's ribs, the wound immediately beginning to fester as supernatural contagions went to work on exposed flesh. "It's over," Mortarion said, raising his weapon for what might be the killing blow. "Accept that much, at least. You fought well, but—" The emergency lighting chose that moment to flicker, a momentary fluctuation in the power grid that sent shadows dancing across the command center. For just an instant, the sickly green glow that had dominated the chamber gave way to the harsh white glare of standard illumination. In that brief moment of clarity, Mortarion saw his reflection in the polished steel of Khan's blade. The sight hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to stagger backward as his mind struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. The thing looking back at him from Khan's sword wasn't the Primarch he remembered being, wasn't even recognizably human anymore. It was a walking corpse, a collection of rotting flesh and exposed bone held together by demonic power and malevolent will. The face, Emperor's mercy, what had been done to his face, was a ruin of decay and corruption. Yellowed bone showed through gaps in putrid skin, and his eyes burned with fires that had nothing to do with human intelligence or emotion. He looked like something that belonged in the deepest pits of hell, not commanding the forces of what had once been the most disciplined legion in the galaxy. What? Mortarion's voice came out as a whisper, the scythe trembling in his suddenly nerveless fingers. What have I become? The question hung in the air between them, carrying a weight of horror and recognition that transcended the physical combat they had been engaged in. Khan, wounded and exhausted, lowered his own weapon as he saw the change that had come over his corrupted brother. You became what you always feared most, Khan said quietly. You became Nekara. The name hit Mortarion like a dagger to the heart, bringing with it a flood of memories he had spent decades trying to suppress. Barbarous. The poisonous overlords who had ruled from their high towers, wielding sorcery and corruption to maintain their dominion over the human settlements below. Nekara, his foster father, who had claimed to love him even as he taught him to embrace the very darkness that had enslaved their world. Power is the only truth, Nekara had said, his voice echoing across the years with perfect clarity. Everything else is illusion, wishful thinking, the desperate lies the weak tell themselves to avoid facing reality. Embrace what you are, my son. Become what you were meant to be. Mortarion remembered killing him, remembered the satisfaction of watching that evil old man die, believing that he was striking a blow for freedom and justice. But now, looking at his reflection in Khan's blade, he understood that the victory had been hollow. Nekara hadn't died at all. He had simply found a new host, a new vessel for the corruption that had defined his existence. All those years of fighting against psychers and sorcery, all those passionate speeches about the dangers of warpcraft and unnatural power, and in the end, he had become the very thing he had sworn to destroy. Not gradually, not through subtle corruption, but willingly, eagerly. He had knelt before Nurgle and begged for the power to save his sons, never considering that the price might be becoming exactly what he had always hated. No, Mortarion said, the word coming out as a growl of rage and self-loathing. No, I will not be him. I will not be what he wanted me to become. The rejection came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, deeper than strategy or tactics, or any rational consideration of consequences. It came from the core of who Mortarion had been before the corruption, before the desperate bargain in the warp storm, before the weight of command had ground his ideals into compromise and accommodation. It came from the young warrior who had looked up at Nekara's tower and sworn that he would never bow to any power that demanded surrender of his essential self. I refuse, Mortarion roared, and the words carried power, not the diseased strength of Nurgle's gifts, but something else, something that had been buried, but never truly killed. I refuse your gifts. I refuse your love. I refuse everything you have made me. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The corruption that had sustained Mortarion for months began to writhe and burn, fighting against his will like a living thing that had suddenly found itself rejected by its host. His flesh bubbled and steamed as supernatural diseases warred with his enhanced physiology, each pathogen designed to be permanent, suddenly finding itself unwelcome. Pain like nothing he had ever experienced tore through his consciousness as decades of accumulated corruption fought against his rejection. It felt like being flayed alive from the inside, like every cell in his body was being individually examined and judged and found wanting. He could feel Nurgle's attention focusing on him across the vast distance of the warp, the Chaos God's rage and bewilderment at this unprecedented defiance. "You cannot reject what you have become," the voice whispered in his mind, carrying the authority of eons and the weight of cosmic certainty. "You are mine, Mortarion. You have always been mine. From the moment you knelt in the darkness, your soul belonged to me." "My soul," Mortarion gasped, falling to his knees as the purification process tore through his transformed physiology, "belongs to me." The command center shook as reality itself seemed to buckle under the strain of what was happening. Tactical displays exploded in showers of sparks, the walls themselves beginning to crack as forces that had never been meant to interact in this way clashed within the confines of mortal space. Khan watched in fascination and horror as his brother writhed on the deck, corruption literally boiling away from his flesh in clouds of noxious vapor. The sight was simultaneously the most beautiful and most terrible thing he had ever witnessed. Redemption and agony intertwined so closely that they became indistinguishable from each other. Mortarion's scream of pain and rage echoed through the spaceport's corridors, carrying with it harmonics that existed in dimensions human senses couldn't perceive. Throughout Lion's Gate, Death Guard forces paused in their duties as they felt something fundamental shift in their connection to their Primarch. Some fell to their knees in confusion and anguish. Others simply stood motionless, waiting for orders that might never come again. The purification process seemed to go on forever, though Khan's chronometer would later record it as lasting only 17 minutes and 36 seconds. When it finally ended, Mortarion collapsed face first onto the deck plating, his body steaming but recognizably human once again. Khan approached cautiously, his blade ready but not raised. The figure on the ground was smaller than the demon prince he had been fighting, closer to the proportions of a normal Primarch, though still obviously changed by his experiences. The worst of the corruption was gone, but the cost of its removal was written in every line of exhausted agony that marked his brother's face. "Mortarion?" Khan said quietly. "Can you hear me?" The pale Primarch's eyes opened, and for the first time in months they were completely, recognizably human. When he spoke, his voice was rough with pain, but free of the wet undertones that had marked his corruption. "I can hear you," Mortarion whispered. "I can hear everything, including the sound of a god screaming in rage because something that was never supposed to be possible just happened." Khan looked around the ruined command center, processing the implications of what he had just witnessed. A demon Primarch had rejected chaos through sheer force of will. It shouldn't have been possible. According to everything they knew about corruption and the nature of the warp, it was impossible. But it had happened anyway, and the universe would never be quite the same. "What happens now?" Khan asked. Mortarion struggled to sit up, wincing as movement sent fresh waves of pain through his ravaged nervous system. When he looked at Khan, his expression carried a weight of determination that the White Scars Primarch remembered from their days of fighting together during the Great Crusade. "Now," Mortarion said, "we find out if redemption is something that can be earned, or if some sins are truly unforgivable. And we do it together, brother, because I'm going to need help for what comes next." Khan studied his redeemed brother for a long moment, weighing everything that had brought them to this point. Then he sheathed his blade and extended his hand. Together, he agreed, and helped Mortarion to his feet. Outside, the siege of Terra continued, but something fundamental had changed. For the first time since the heresy began, one of the fallen had found their way back to the light. Whether that light would be enough to illuminate the darkness ahead remained to be seen. Chapter 6. The God's Wrath in the Garden of Nurgle. Something that had never happened in all the countless eons of the chaos. God's existence finally came to pass. For the first time since achieving demonic apotheosis, Grandfather Nurgle felt something that might have been described as surprise. The sensation was so alien, so fundamentally at odds with his nature as a force of cosmic inevitability, that it took several moments for the Lord of Decay to process what he was experiencing. His garden, a realm where time flowed like honey, and every disease that had ever existed bloomed in eternal profusion, shuddered around him, as reality struggled to accommodate something that simply should not have been possible. One of his chosen sons had said no. Not the desperate no of a mortal facing corruption, which was simply a prelude to eventual acceptance. Not the defiant no of a warrior dying clean, which was merely another form of surrender. This had been something far more dangerous, the fundamental rejection of a gift, freely given and gladly received, spoken with the full knowledge of what was being cast aside. Mortarion had broken a covenant written in the deepest laws of the warp itself, and in doing so had torn a wound in the fabric of chaos that would not easily heal. Nurgle's roar of rage shook the foundations of his realm, sending waves of putrid energy cascading through dimensions that mortal minds could not comprehend. Ancient plagues that had slumbered for millennia awakened and began to spread with renewed virulence. Demonic servants throughout the garden fell to their knees as their master's fury washed over them like a tsunami of concentrated malevolence. But beneath the rage, deeper and more troubling than the anger itself, was something that Nurgle had not felt in longer than most galaxies had existed. Uncertainty. If one of his demon princes could reject the gifts of chaos through sheer force of will, what did that mean for the fundamental nature of corruption? What did it mean for the great game that he and his brothers had been playing since before the birth of stars? What did it mean for the cosmic order that declared all souls, once touched by the warp, belonged to the powers that claimed them? The implications were staggering, and Grandfather Nurgle did not care for implications. He preferred certainties, the certainty that all things rotted, that all flesh decayed, that all hope eventually curdled into despair. This development threatened the very foundations of those certainties, and that could not be permitted to stand. "Bring him back," Nurgle commanded, his voice rippling through layers of reality like a stone cast into still water. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, bring my son back to me." But even as he spoke the words, Nurgle knew they might be impossible to fulfill. The severance had been too complete, too absolute. Mortarion had not simply rejected Nurgle's gifts, he had somehow purged them from his very essence, burning away decades of accumulated corruption through nothing more than the sheer force of his will to be free. It was, the Lord of Decay admitted to himself, rather magnificent, which only made it more intolerable. Across the breadth of Terra's scarred surface, every Death Guard warrior suddenly staggered as something fundamental shifted in their connection to their gene father. Captain Thorgram of the 8th Company felt it first as a hollow ache in his chest, a sensation like losing something precious that he couldn't quite remember ever having. He was in the middle of directing an assault on one of the palace's outer bastions when the feeling hit him, causing him to stumble and nearly fall from the command platform where he had been coordinating artillery strikes. "Captain?" His sergeant's voice carried concern beneath its vox distortion. Are you injured?" Thorgrim tried to answer, and found that words would not come. How could he explain that something had been torn away from him, some vital connection that had sustained him through months of campaigning? The corruption that had defined his existence for so long was still there. He could feel the diseases coursing through his transformed flesh, could sense the supernatural resilience that allowed him to shrug off wounds that would fell lesser warriors. But the spiritual anchor that had given those gifts meaning was simply gone. "I can't feel him," Thorgrim whispered, the admission torn from him like a confession under torture. "I can't feel the Primarch." The sergeant's helmet turned toward Lionsgate Spaceport, where their Gene father had been directing the siege from his command center. From their position, they could see strange lights flickering through the structure's upper levels, patterns of illumination that suggested something was very wrong indeed. "Orders, sir?" the sergeant asked, though his voice carried the same uncertainty that was spreading through Thorgrim's thoughts. Before the captain could answer, a new sensation washed through his consciousness, not the warm, nurturing presence of Nurgle's blessings, but something else, entirely. Something that felt like hope. The emotion was so alien, so completely at odds with everything he had experienced since his transformation, that it left him reeling. Across the siege lines, similar scenes were playing out as hundreds of Death Guard warriors felt their connection to their Primarch flicker and change. Some fell to their knees, weeping toxic tears as they experienced emotions they had thought lost forever. Others stood motionless, trying to process the implications of what they were feeling. And in the deepest bunkers beneath the palace, loyalist psychers monitoring the warp storms around Terra began to detect something that their instruments insisted could not be possible. A point of pure light burning like a star in the heart of the chaos-tainted darkness surrounding the planet. In the command center of the vengeful spirit, Horus Lupercal felt the psychic shockwave wash over him like a physical blow. The War Master was in the middle of reviewing tactical reports when the sensation hit, causing his enhanced senses to reel as something fundamental shifted in the warp currents surrounding Terra. For a moment, the connection he shared with the Chaos Gods wavered, their whispers becoming distant and uncertain. "My lord?" Erebus approached cautiously, his own expression troubled by whatever he was sensing through his connection to the Dark Gods. "Something has happened. The warp storms around Terra are changing." Horus closed his eyes and extended his consciousness toward the disturbance, probing the edges of whatever phenomenon was causing such upheaval in the immaterium. What he found there made his blood run cold. The psychic signature was unmistakably that of a Primarch, but not as he had ever sensed one before. Instead of the usual complex interplay of human will and demonic enhancement that characterized the Fallen Brothers, this felt like purity. Like a soul that had been touched by chaos and somehow emerged from the experience cleaner than before. "Mortarion," Horus breathed, understanding flooding through him with terrible clarity. "What have you done, brother?" The implications were staggering. If one of the demon princes could somehow reverse their corruption, what did that mean for the rest of them? What did it mean for the promises the Dark Gods had made, the power they had been granted in exchange for their souls? Most terrifyingly of all, what did it mean for the success of their rebellion against the Emperor? Horus's first instinct was to send forces immediately to Lion's Gate, to either reclaim his fallen brother or ensure that whatever had happened to him could not spread to the other traitor legions. But even as the thought formed, he could sense the attention of the Chaos Gods turning toward Terra with an intensity that made the air itself seem to thicken with malevolent purpose. The Dark Gods were mobilizing, pouring more of their essence into the material realm than they had since the beginning of the heresy. Whatever had happened to Mortarion, they clearly considered it a threat significant enough to warrant their direct intervention, which meant that the stakes of the siege had just risen beyond anything Horus had originally envisioned. In the deepest chambers of the imperial palace, the Emperor of mankind suddenly lifted his head from the psychic workings that had been consuming his attention for days. For just a moment, the golden light that suffused his form flickered brighter, responding to something that even his transcendent consciousness found noteworthy. Through the layers of psychic shielding that protected the palace's core, through the interference of the warp storms that raged around Terra, he had felt something impossible. Hope. Not the desperate hope of mortals facing extinction, not the false hope that the chaos gods sometimes offered to their victims, but genuine hope, the kind that came from choosing light over darkness, even when the cost was almost unbearable. One of his sons had found his way back from the abyss. Against every law of corruption that governed the warp, against the fundamental nature of chaos itself, Mortarion had somehow chosen redemption over damnation. The Emperor's consciousness touched the edges of the phenomenon, briefly, just long enough to confirm what his initial sensing had suggested. Then he withdrew, allowing a smile that had not graced his features in decades to briefly transform his golden countenance. Perhaps, after all, there was still something worth saving in this galaxy. But even as that thought formed, he could feel the dark gods marshalling their power for a response that would dwarf anything they had attempted before. They could not allow this precedent to stand, could not permit the possibility that their hold over the souls they claimed might not be absolute. The real war, the Emperor realized, was only just beginning. Back in the command center of Lion's Gate spaceport, Mortarion convulsed as another wave of purification tore through his transformed physiology. The process was far from complete. Decades of accumulated corruption could not be purged in a single moment of will, no matter how absolute that will might be. Each contaminated cell had to be examined and cleansed individually, each tainted organ rebuilt from the ground up, each corrupted thought pattern unraveled and rewoven into something recognizably human. But it was working. With each wave of agony that racked his frame, Mortarion could feel more of his original self returning. Not the bitter, cynical commander who had made the bargain with Nurgle, but the idealistic young warrior who had first taken up arms against the tyrants of Barbarous. "The corruption is fighting back," Khan observed, watching his brother writhe on the deck plating. "I can see it moving under your skin, trying to re-establish itself." "It's not just the corruption," Mortarion gasped between waves of pain. "Nurgle himself is trying to reclaim me. I can feel his will pressing against mine, trying to force me back into the mold he created." Khan's grip tightened on his sword hilt. "Can you resist him?" Mortarion's answer was to scream again, as another surge of purification burned through his nervous system. When the wave passed, he looked up at his brother with eyes that were becoming more human with each passing moment. "I have to," he said simply, "because if I don't, if I let him drag me back into that garden of horrors, then this chance, this impossible, unprecedented chance, will be lost forever. And I'll have betrayed not just myself, but every soul who might someday face the same choice I did." Khan nodded grimly, understanding the weight that his brother now carried. This was no longer just about Mortarion's personal redemption. It was about proving that redemption was possible at all, that the hold of chaos over corrupted souls was not absolute. Outside the command center, the siege of Terra raged on, but something fundamental had changed in its nature. For the first time since the heresy began, one of the fallen had chosen to rise again. Whether that choice would be enough to change the fate of the galaxy remained to be seen. But for now, it was enough that the choice had been made at all. Chapter 7. Brothers in the Storm. Khan stood over his brother's convulsing form and faced the hardest decision of his life. The strategic calculus was brutally simple. Lion's Gate spaceport remained in enemy hands, its capture essential to the loyalist defense of Terra. The Death Guard forces throughout the complex were in disarray, leaderless and confused by the severing of their connection to their Primarch. This was the perfect opportunity to complete his original mission: eliminate Mortarion and secure the spaceport for the Emperor's forces. All it would require was a single stroke of his blade, while his brother lay helpless and purging decades of corruption from his ravaged system. Khan raised his sword, angling the point toward Mortarion's exposed throat. One quick thrust, and the siege of Terra would shift decisively in the Loyalists' favor. The Death Guard would fragment without their Gene Father's leadership. Lion's Gate would fall within hours, and the traitors would lose their most crucial staging area for future assaults. It would be the practical choice, the smart choice, the choice that would save the most lives in the long run. But as Khan looked down at his brother, at the man who had somehow found the strength to reject the gifts of a chaos god through sheer force of will, he found himself thinking about different kinds of calculations entirely. "You're going to help him, aren't you?" The voice came from behind him, and Khan turned to see Master Sagyar approaching through the ruined command center. The White Scars veteran's face was grim beneath his ritual scars, but there was no judgment in his expression. Only the weary acceptance of a soldier who had served long enough to recognize the moment when strategy gave way to something more important. "He broke free," Khan said, not lowering his weapon, but not striking either. "Against every law of corruption, against the fundamental nature of chaos itself, he broke free. How can I kill a man who just accomplished the impossible?" Sagyar moved to one of the shattered observation windows, looking out at the chaos spreading through the spaceport below. Death Guard forces were abandoning their positions in growing numbers, some collapsing as the severance of their connection to Mortarion left them unable to function, others simply standing motionless as they tried to process what they were feeling. "Because he might not stay free," Sagyar said quietly. "Because the corruption might reassert itself. Because even if his rejection is genuine, he's still the Primarch who led his legion into damnation in the first place." Khan considered this, watching as another wave of purification tore through Mortarion's frame. His brother's flesh was changing, the worst of the decay literally sloughing away to reveal skin that was pale but recognizably human beneath. The transformation was real, undeniable, but so were the decades of choices that had led to his corruption in the first place. "I know," Khan said, "but I also know that redemption earned in the face of absolute horror means more than innocence that was never tested. If we kill every fallen brother who tries to find their way back to the light, what message does that send to the others who might someday face the same choice?" Before Sagyar could respond, the air in the command center began to thicken with an oily malevolence that made both warriors reach instinctively for their weapons. The temperature dropped by several degrees, and frost began to form on the damaged equipment, despite the recycled atmosphere of the enclosed space. "Something's coming," Khan said, his enhanced senses detecting movement in dimensions that human perception couldn't access. Multiple contacts, immaterial origin. The first demon materialized near the eastern wall, a creature of putrid flesh and diseased bone that bore the unmistakable mark of Nurgle's favor. Its presence brought with it the stench of open graves and rotting vegetation, an olfactory assault so intense that even Khan's enhanced physiology recoiled. "Give us back our brother," The thing spoke with a voice like wet earth collapsing into a tomb. "Return what was stolen, and your deaths will be swift." Khan's response was to move between the demon and Mortarion's prone form, his blade held ready for combat. Nothing was stolen here. A choice was made freely by someone with the right to make it. The demon's laughter was the sound of diseased lungs struggling to expel corrupted air. "Choice? There is no choice, little hawk. All roads lead back to the grandfather's garden eventually. All souls return to the embrace of decay." More demons began to manifest around the command center's perimeter. 12 of them, then 24, then so many that counting became meaningless. They came in all the forms that Nurgle's creativity could devise. Bloated plague bearers oozing with supernatural diseases, skeletal decay spawn whose very presence caused metal to rust and ceramite to crumble, writhing masses of infected flesh that defied any attempt at classification. "Lord Khan," Sagiar's voice carried the professional calm of a veteran facing overwhelming odds. "I count at least 40 hostiles, with more manifesting every few seconds. Our ammunition won't last long against numbers like these." Khan glanced down at Mortarion, who was still convulsing as the purification process continued its agonizing work. His brother's eyes were open now, aware but unfocused, his consciousness clearly fighting a battle on levels that had nothing to do with the material realm. "We hold," Khan said simply, "for as long as it takes." The first demon attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm their defensive position through sheer weight of numbers. Khan met the charge with a fury that surprised even him, his blade work reaching a level of perfection that turned defense into art. Each strike found its mark, sending demons back to the warp with wounds that would take centuries to heal. But for everyone he banished, 2 more seemed to take its place, the command center becoming a charnel house of ichor and ectoplasm as the battle raged. Sagiar fought beside him with the disciplined precision of a White Scars veteran, his bolter chattering in controlled bursts that put down anything Khan's blade missed. But even enhanced Astartes had limits, and those limits were approaching fast under the strain of fighting and seemingly infinite number of supernatural enemies. "Khan," Mortarion's voice, weak but recognizably human, called from the deck where he lay. "Get away from me. They're here for me. Don't let them take you too." "Not happening, brother," Khan replied without breaking his rhythm, decapitating a plague bearer that had gotten too close to Mortarion's position. "We've lost too many already to stupid pride and poor choices. I'm not losing you to a pack of demons just after you found your way back." The battle continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, time becoming elastic under the strain of fighting enemies that existed partially outside normal causality. Khan could feel his strength beginning to flag, the corruption in the air slowly wearing down his enhanced physiology, despite his resistance to its effects. But gradually, he began to notice that the demon attacks were becoming less coordinated, their manifestations less stable. Several of the creatures flickered in and out of visible existence, as if something was interfering with their ability to maintain coherent form in the material realm. "They're weakening," Sagiar observed, putting 3 bolter rounds through the center mass of a demon that promptly dissolved into noxious vapor. "Whatever's happening to the Primarch, it's affecting their ability to maintain corporeal existence." Khan risked a glance toward Mortarion and saw that the purification process was reaching some kind of crescendo. His brother's body was surrounded by a faint golden light, not the sickly phosphorescence of corruption, but something cleaner, something that reminded Khan of the Emperor's own psychic radiance during the rare occasions when the master of mankind chose to reveal his true nature. They can't claim what they no longer have a connection to, Khan realized, As the corruption leaves him, their hold weakens. The remaining demons seemed to reach the same conclusion, their attacks becoming increasingly desperate as they sensed their window of opportunity closing. One of the larger creatures, a grotesque thing that might once have been a plague marine before its transformation into something purely demonic, made a final lunge toward Mortarion's position. Khan intercepted it with a perfectly timed strike that opened its torso from sternum to pelvis, spilling putrid organs across the command center's deck. The demon looked down at the wound with what might have been surprise, then slowly dissolved back into the immaterial realm from which it had emerged. "It is finished," the largest of the remaining demons spoke, its voice carrying a weight of cosmic finality. "For now. But this is not over, little hawk. The grandfather's memory is long, and his patience is infinite. We will be watching for any sign of weakness, any moment of doubt or despair. And when that moment comes, and it will come, we will reclaim what belongs to us." The demon's form began to fade, becoming translucent around the edges as its connection to the material realm weakened. But its eyes, ancient, malevolent, filled with the patience of eons, remained fixed on Khan with the intensity of a promise. "Tell us, Primarch of the White Scars," it said as it dissolved completely, "how long can you guard against something that never sleeps, never tires, and never forgets?" Then they were gone, leaving only the stench of corruption and the memory of malevolent presence behind. Khan stood among the aftermath of the battle, his armor scored and blooded, but his grip on his weapon still steady, and looked down at his brother. Mortarion was sitting up now, the worst of the convulsions having passed. His face was gaunt and pale, marked by the ordeal he had just endured, but his eyes were clear and completely human. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had looked into the deepest pits of damnation and somehow found the strength to climb back out. "Thank you," Mortarion said simply. "I know what this cost you, Jagatai. I know what you gave up by choosing to help me instead of finishing your mission. I won't forget that." Khan sheathed his blade and extended a hand to help his brother to his feet. Mortarion took it without hesitation, and for a moment they stood together in the ruins of the command center. Two Primarchs who had found their way back to brotherhood through the crucible of impossible choices. "We're not done yet," Khan said. "The spaceport is still in Death Guard hands. The siege continues. And half the galaxy thinks you're still a demon prince of Nurgle. We've got work to do if we're going to make this mean anything." Mortarion nodded, testing his balance as he adjusted to his restored, if changed, physiology. "Where do we start?" Khan looked toward the command center's tactical displays, most of which had been damaged in the daemon attack, but some of which were still functional enough to show the chaotic state of the forces under Mortarion's former command. "We start by convincing your sons that redemption is possible," he said. "And then we show the rest of the galaxy that the outcome of this war is far from decided." Mortarion's smile was the first genuinely hopeful expression Khan had seen from his brother in longer than he cared to remember. "Together?" Mortarion asked. "Together," Khan confirmed, and for the first time since the siege of Terra began, he found himself believing that they might actually have a chance of winning something more than just a tactical victory. Outside the command center, Lionsgate Spaceport continued to burn, but in the heart of that fire, something new was being forged. Not just the redemption of a fallen Primarch, but the possibility that even in the darkest hour, hope could still find a way to survive. Chapter 8. The Legion Divided. The first sign that something had fundamentally changed came when Captain Korak of the 3rd Company tried to access the plague reserves in Storage Bay Gamma 7 and found his authorization codes no longer worked. For a moment, he stared at the denial rune blinking on the security panel, certain there had been some kind of technical malfunction. He was a Death Guard captain, marked with Nurgle's blessings and sworn to the Grandfather's service. These weapons had been crafted specifically for his use, their diseased payloads attuned to his corrupted physiology and psychic signature. They should have responded to his touch like faithful hounds, answering their master's call. Instead, the storage bay remained sealed, its biomechanical locks rejecting him as if he were some stranger who had never sworn the oaths of corruption or endured the gifts of transformation. The sensation was deeply unsettling, like looking in a mirror and failing to recognize the face that stared back. "Captain," Sergeant Vorthek approached from the main corridor, his own expression troubled beneath the decay that had claimed the left side of his face. "The ammunition dispensers in Section 4 are also offline. The machine spirits won't acknowledge our command codes." Korak turned from the sealed storage bay, his mind racing through possible explanations for what they were experiencing. Equipment malfunction seemed unlikely. The Death Guard maintained their weapons with the same methodical precision they brought to everything else, and multiple simultaneous failures across different systems suggested a more fundamental problem. "Have you tried accessing the Primarch?" Korak asked, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew what the answer would be. Vorthek's silence was confirmation enough. The psychic connection that had sustained every Death Guard since their transformation, the warm, nurturing presence of their Gene Father's will, channeled through Nurgle's infinite love, was simply gone. Not weakened or distorted, but completely absent, leaving a hollow ache where certainty had once resided. "Orders, sir?" Vorthek asked, though his voice carried the lost quality of a child asking directions in an unfamiliar city. Before Korak could answer, the sound of bolter fire echoed through the spaceport's corridors, followed by the distinctive wet explosion of a plague grenade detonating. Both Marines immediately reached for their weapons, training taking over where certainty had failed. "Contact, northeast quadrant," came the Vox transmission from Squad Tertius. "Multiple Death Guard engaging each other with lethal force. Repeat, Death Guard engaging Death Guard. Requesting immediate orders." Korak exchanged glances with Vorthek, seeing his own confusion reflected in the sergeant's ruined features. Death Guard fighting Death Guard made no sense. Their legion had always prided itself on unity of purpose, on the absolute loyalty that bound every warrior to his brothers and his Primarch. "All units, hold position and assess targets carefully," Korak commanded over the squad channel. "No engagement without positive identification of hostile intent. I want to know what's happening before we start shooting at our own brothers." But even as he spoke, Korak was beginning to understand what was happening. The absence of Mortarion's presence in their minds, the failure of corruption-attuned equipment to respond to their commands, the reports of internal fighting. It all pointed to a schism that cut to the very heart of what it meant to be Death Guard. Their Primarch had changed, and that change was tearing the Legion apart. 3 levels above Korak's position, First Captain Callus Typhon stood in the ruins of what had once been a strategic planning chamber, and felt the first stirrings of genuine rage he had experienced in decades. The connection to Mortarion was gone. That much was undeniable. But unlike the confusion and despair that seemed to be affecting the rank and file, Typhon's response was one of cold, calculated fury. He had not endured the agonies of transformation, had not embraced the gifts of the Destroyer Hive, and accepted the name Typhus, only to watch his Primarch throw it all away in a moment of weakness. "My lord," Captain Vorlex approached cautiously, reading the dangerous stillness in Typhon's posture with the skill of a warrior who had served alongside him for over a century. The situation reports are coming in. Nearly 40% of our forces have ceased responding to standard command protocols. Typhon turned from the shattered window, through which he had been watching the chaos spread through Lionsgate Spaceport, his face a mask of diseased flesh and implacable will. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had never doubted his own righteousness. "They're confused," he said, the words carrying a weight of dismissive contempt. "Weak-minded fools who can't function without constant guidance from above. They'll come around once they realize that Grandfather Nurgle's love hasn't abandoned them. Only their Primarch has." Vorlex shifted uncomfortably, his own loyalty to Typhon warring with the ingrained habit of obedience to their gene father. "What are your orders, my lord?" Typhon's smile was a terrible thing to behold, equal parts affection and predation. "Gather the faithful, the ones who remember their true oaths, who understand that our allegiance belongs to the god of decay, first, and the Primarch, second. We're going to remind our wayward brothers what it means to serve a power greater than themselves. And if they refuse to listen, then we'll give them the gift of enlightenment," Typhon replied, his hand moving to rest on the grip of his man-reaper, one way or another. In the lower levels of the spaceport, Apothecary Volgrim knelt beside the convulsing form of Brother Kestrel and tried to understand what he was witnessing. Kestrel had been one of the most stable members of Third Company, his transformation, by Nurgle's gifts, complete and apparently irreversible. His body had hosted 17 different disease strains in perfect symbiotic harmony, each one contributing to his supernatural resilience and combat effectiveness. Now those same diseases were at war within his flesh, attacking each other and their host with a virulence that defied every medical principle Volgrim had learned during his centuries of service. The Marine's armor was cracking as his body swelled and contracted in response to whatever process was consuming him from within. "Help me!" Kestrel gasped, his voice barely recognizable through the fluid that had begun to fill his lungs. Can't control it anymore. They're fighting each other. All of them. Fighting." Volgrim checked his medical scanners and found readings that made no sense according to conventional understanding of corruption dynamics. The bacterial cultures that should have been working in perfect harmony were indeed attacking each other, creating a cascade of metabolic failures that was rapidly breaking down Kestrel's enhanced physiology. It was as if the removal of some central organizing principle had caused the entire ecosystem of corruption to collapse into chaos. "The Primarch," Kestrel managed to say, during a brief lull in his convulsions. "Something happened to the Primarch. I can feel it. Feel him pulling away from us. The gifts are confused. Don't know what to do without his will to guide them." Volgrim injected a combination of stabilizers and painkillers, hoping to give Kestrel some relief while he tried to process the implications of what he was hearing. If the corruption itself was dependent on Mortarion's psychic presence for stability, then his apparent severance from Nurgle's influence would affect every Death Guard who had undergone the transformation. Some, like Kestrel, were experiencing catastrophic biological failure as their modified physiology tried to adapt to the absence of its guiding principle. Others might be more fortunate, or depending on your perspective, less so. "Apothecary," came a voice from the chamber's entrance, and Volgrim turned to see Brother Sergeant Morvain approaching with careful steps. The veteran warrior looked different, cleaner somehow, though still obviously bearing the marks of his transformation. "Sergeant," Volgrim acknowledged, "are you experiencing any symptoms similar to Brother Kestrel's?" Morvain shook his head, then paused, as if reconsidering the question. "Not exactly. I feel lighter." like something that was pressing down on me for months has finally been lifted. The diseases are still there, but they're not driving me the way they used to. I can think clearly for the first time since the transformation. Volgrim studied his battle brother with growing fascination. Here were two Marines who had undergone identical corruption processes, experiencing completely different reactions to whatever had happened to their Primarch. One was dying as his modified biology collapsed, while the other seemed to be finding some kind of equilibrium between his transformed state and his original nature. "Can you still access the corruption's benefits?" Volgrim asked, pulling up detailed bioscans on his medical equipment. Morvain flexed his hands experimentally, then reached out to touch a piece of exposed metal. Where his fingers made contact, rust immediately began to spread, eating through the steel with supernatural speed. "The gifts are still there," he said wonderingly, "but they feel voluntary now, like I'm choosing to use them instead of being driven by them." "That shouldn't be possible," Volgrim muttered, checking and rechecking his readings. "The corruption is designed to be irreversible, all-consuming. You can't simply choose to control it." "Maybe," Morvain said quietly. "Someone just proved that everything we thought we knew about corruption was wrong." Before Volgrim could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the medical bay. Both Marines turned to see a full squad of Death Guard entering, their weapons drawn and their postures aggressive. "Brother Sergeant Morvain," the squad leader announced, his voice carrying the wet rasp that characterized the most severely transformed Death Guard. "First Captain Typhon requests your immediate presence. You are to come with us." Morvain's hand moved instinctively toward his bolter, then stopped as he processed the implications of what was happening. "Requests?" "Orders," the squad leader corrected, raising his weapon to emphasize the point. "The captain has concerns about your loyalty to the Legion and its true purpose. These concerns require immediate clarification." Volgrim watched the confrontation develop with growing alarm. Whatever schism was tearing through the Death Guard, it was becoming increasingly clear that neutrality would not be an option. Every Marine would be forced to choose a side: those who remained loyal to Nurgle's gifts, as they had been given, or those who followed their Primarch into whatever unknown territory his transformation had opened. "And if I refuse to come?" Morvain asked quietly. The squad leader's smile was visible even through his corrupted features. "Then we provide clarification here and now." Morvain looked at Volgrim, then at the dying Marine, still convulsing on the medical table, then back at the squad of warriors who had once been his brothers in every sense that mattered. "I see," he said, and began to reach for his weapon. The medical bay erupted in gunfire as Death Guard opened fire on Death Guard for the first time in the Legion's proud history. Brothers who had stood together against the horrors of a dozen campaigns now sought each other's deaths with the same methodical precision they had once brought to bear against their enemies. And throughout Lionsgate Spaceport, similar scenes were playing out as the fracture lines in the Legion's unity became impossible to ignore or repair. Some chose the path of their Primarch, whatever that might lead to. Others remained faithful to the gifts they had been given and the God who had granted them. But all of them understood, with the clarity that only comes in moments of absolute crisis, that there could be no compromise between these positions. One side would prevail and the other would be destroyed, because the fundamental question they faced, what it truly meant to be Death Guard, could not accommodate multiple answers. The Civil War had begun, and before it ended, one vision of the Legion's future would lie in ruins, while the other rose triumphant from the ashes of brotherhood destroyed. In the depths of the spaceport, Brother Kestrel's convulsions finally ceased as his corrupted physiology gave up its struggle to maintain coherence without the guiding presence it had been designed to rely upon. Apothecary Volgrim recorded the time of death with the same meticulous attention to detail that had always characterized Death Guard operations, then began to wonder which side in the coming conflict would claim his own loyalty. The Legion was dividing, and every choice that followed would be written in the blood of brothers. Chapter 9. The War Master's Response. The tactical hologram flickered and died for the third time in as many minutes, its machine spirit apparently unable to process the impossibility of what the data feeds were reporting from Lion's Gate spaceport. Horus Lupercal, War Master of Chaos and architect of humanity's greatest civil war, stood before the ruined display and tried to contain the rage that threatened to consume what remained of his strategic objectivity. The reports coming in from Terra's surface were clear enough in their individual details, but taken together, they painted a picture that violated every assumption upon which his campaign had been built. Mortarion had rejected the gifts of chaos, not fled from them, not been somehow severed from them by external force, but actively and willfully rejected them through what could only be described as an act of unprecedented defiance. The psychic shockwaves were still reverberating through the warp, carrying with them implications that made even the dark gods themselves pause in their eternal scheming. "My lord," Captain Abaddon approached with the careful steps of a warrior who had learned to read the War Master's moods with survival-level precision. The latest reports from Lion's Gate confirm the initial assessments. The Death Guard Legion is in complete disarray, with confirmed instances of internal fighting throughout their positions. Horus turned from the failed hologram, his gaze fixing on his most trusted captain with an intensity that made the air itself seem to thicken. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that belonged to more than one throat, the influence of the Chaos Gods making itself known through barely controlled fury. "How many?" Horus asked, each word carefully measured to avoid the explosion of rage that lurked beneath his controlled exterior. "Preliminary estimates suggest approximately 60% of Death Guard forces have ceased effective operations," Abaddon reported, consulting the data slate in his hands. "Of the remainder, roughly half appear to be following some kind of purification process, while the others are actively engaging their former brothers in combat." The silence that followed lasted long enough for several junior officers to exchange nervous glances. Horus's reputation for explosive anger was well established, but his moments of deadly quiet were far more dangerous to those around him. 60%, Horus repeated finally. "Our most reliable legion, the one force I could depend on to hold any position regardless of cost, has been reduced to 60% effectiveness, because one of my brothers decided to have a crisis of conscience." "The situation may be recoverable," Abaddon offered carefully. "First, Captain Typhon is organizing the loyalist elements, and early reports suggest he's having some success in maintaining unit cohesion among those who remain faithful to their oaths." "Typhon?" Horus's smile was not a pleasant thing to witness. "Yes. Callus has always been a practical man, more committed to the cause than even his own Primarch, it would seem. But tell me, Ezekiel, what happens to our timeline if Lionsgate Spaceport becomes a battleground between competing Death Guard factions instead of a staging area for our next assault on the palace?" Abaddon's expression tightened as he processed the strategic implications. "The entire northern approach becomes untenable. Without reliable control of the spaceport, we can't bring up the siege engines necessary for a direct assault on the palace walls. The campaign timeline extends by weeks, possibly months." "Weeks we don't have," Horus said, moving to the command chamber's primary viewport and staring out at Terra's scarred surface. "Gilliman and the Lion are already en route with substantial reinforcements. Every day we waste dealing with this unexpected development brings them closer to breaking our siege entirely. The War Master's enhanced senses could detect the psychic turbulence radiating outward from Lion's Gate, waves of conflicting emotion and will that spoke to a level of internal strife that went far beyond simple tactical confusion. What Mortarion had done wasn't just a personal redemption, it was a fundamental challenge to the cosmic order that the entire rebellion had been built upon. If a demon Primarch could reject chaos through sheer force of will, what did that mean for the promises the dark gods had made? What did it mean for the power they had granted in exchange for souls freely given? Most importantly, what did it mean for the other traitor Primarchs who had made similar bargains? "My lord," another voice interrupted Horus's brooding, and he turned to see Malagurst approaching with a sealed communication cylinder. "Priority transmission from the Iron Warriors' positions. Lord Perturabo requests immediate strategic conference." Horus accepted the cylinder and broke its seals, scanning the contents with growing interest. Perturabo's messages were always models of tactical precision, but this one carried an undercurrent of concern that the Lord of Iron rarely allowed to show in his official communications. The psychic emanations from Lion's Gate are affecting siege engine targeting systems, multiple machine spirits showing signs of confusion or outright rebellion. Recommend immediate consultation to reassess operational parameters. "Convene a war council," Horus commanded, his strategic mind already beginning to adapt to the changed circumstances. "All Primarchs currently on system, plus senior Legion commanders. We need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with and adjust our plans accordingly." "Including Lord Angron?" Abaddon asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be problematic. "Especially Angron," Horus confirmed. "If this condition proves to be contagious, the World Eaters need to understand what signs to watch for among their own ranks." As Abaddon moved to carry out his orders, Horus found himself alone, with thoughts that had been growing increasingly dark since the first reports had reached him. The rebellion had always been a carefully balanced equation. The power of chaos weighed against the cost of that power, the benefits of demonic enhancement measured against the loss of human autonomy. Mortarion's defection suggested that equation might not be as stable as the dark gods had claimed. The War Council convened in the Vengeful Spirit's primary strategium 2 hours later, with the ship's most powerful psychic shields activated to prevent eavesdropping by Loyalist forces. The assembled Primarchs represented the core of traitor leadership: Horus himself, Perturabo with his cold tactical genius, Angron radiating barely controlled fury, and Fulgrim attending via hollow projection from his own flagship. "Brothers," Horus began, his voice carrying the authority that had once made him the Emperor's chosen successor. "We face an unprecedented situation that threatens the very foundations of our campaign. I trust you've all reviewed the preliminary reports from Lion's Gate." Perturabo leaned forward over the tactical display, his scarred features impassive as he highlighted key positions with mechanical precision. "The strategic implications are severe, but not necessarily catastrophic. If we can contain the situation to Lion's Gate itself, we can adjust our approach vectors and maintain operational tempo." "Contain it how?" Angron's voice was a growl of barely suppressed violence, the nails in his skull sparking with agitation. "By killing every Death Guard who starts showing signs of... what? Conscience? Second thoughts about the choices we made?" "If necessary, yes," Perturabo replied without emotion. "The mission parameters haven't changed, brother. Terra must fall, the Emperor must die, and humanity must be freed from the tyranny of false hope. If some of our forces prove insufficiently committed to those objectives, then they become obstacles to be removed." Fulgrim's holographic image shimmered as he laughed, the sound carrying undertones of genuine amusement mixed with something darker. How deliciously ironic. The legion that prided itself on endurance and loyalty proves to have the weakest resolve when tested by their own choices. "It's not weakness," Horus said quietly, and the certainty in his voice made the other Primarchs turn their attention to him. "That's what worries me. What Mortarion did, rejecting decades of corruption through nothing but force of will, required strength that I'm not certain any of us possess." The chamber fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. If Mortarion's defection had been born from weakness, it could be dismissed as an aberration, a failure of character that didn't reflect on the fundamental soundness of their cause. But if it required strength, "You think it could happen to others," Angron said, and for once his voice was free of the rage that usually defined his existence. "You think other legions might start questioning what we've become?" "I think," Horus said carefully, "that we need to consider the possibility that the hold of chaos over our souls is not as absolute as we've been led to believe. And if that's true, then everything we've sacrificed, everything we've endured, might have been optional." Perturabo's expression didn't change, but his mechanical augmetics whirred softly as he processed the strategic ramifications. "Recommended course of action?" Horus moved to the chamber's viewport, looking out at the sprawling battlefields of Terra, where hundreds of thousands of warriors were dying for competing visions of humanity's future. The sight that had once filled him with satisfaction now seemed somehow hollow. "We accelerate the timeline," he decided. "Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, we end this siege before doubt can spread any further through our ranks. A quick victory will silence questions about the price of that victory." "And if Mortarion tries to interfere?" Fulgrim asked, his tone suggesting he would welcome the opportunity for another confrontation between brothers. "Then we remind him," Horus said, his voice carrying the cold finality of someone who had made peace with necessary horrors, that redemption is a luxury that can only be afforded by the victorious. The dead have no need of clean consciences. But even as he spoke the words, Horus couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of forces that governed their war. Mortarion's defection wasn't just a tactical setback. It was a crack in the certainty that had sustained them through years of increasingly desperate choices. And cracks, Horus knew from bitter experience, had a tendency to spread unless they were addressed quickly and decisively. The war for Terra would continue, but the war for the souls of the traitor Primarchs had just taken a turn that none of them had foreseen. In his private chambers aboard the Iron Blood, Perturabo stood before a tactical display showing the siege lines around Terra, and wondered if his brothers understood just how precarious their position had become. The loss of Lionsgate as a reliable staging area was serious enough, but the psychological effects of Mortarion's defection could prove far more damaging in the long run. Every traitor legionnaire would now be wondering if the corruption that defined their existence was truly irreversible, if the choices they had made in darkness could somehow be unmade in light. Doubt was poison to military efficiency, and they could afford no inefficiency in the battles to come. But there was another consideration that Perturabo kept to himself, a possibility that he suspected the others weren't ready to face. If Mortarion could reject chaos through force of will alone, then perhaps their entire understanding of corruption had been flawed from the beginning. Perhaps they had never been as bound to the dark gods as they believed. The thought should have been liberating. Instead, it filled Perturabo with a cold dread that had nothing to do with tactical considerations, and everything to do with the growing suspicion that they had traded away their humanity for power that might not have required such a price after all. He dismissed the thought with the same mechanical precision he brought to all inconvenient emotions, but it lingered at the edges of his consciousness like a virus in a machine's spirit, ready to corrupt his certainty when he could least afford such weakness. The siege would continue. Terra would fall. The Emperor would die. But the cost of that victory was beginning to look higher than any of them had imagined, and the bills were coming due whether they were prepared to pay them or not. Chapter 10. The Emperor's Choice. In the deepest chambers of the Imperial Palace, where psychic barriers thick enough to stop demon princes created a sanctuary of relative peace amid the chaos of war, the Emperor of Mankind suddenly stilled in his meditations. For days he had been focused inward, his consciousness flowing through the network of defenses that protected Terra's most vital installations. The siege demanded constant attention, every breached wall sealed with will alone, every demon incursion banished through the application of power that would have reduced mountains to ash. But now something had penetrated even his focused concentration, a psychic emanation so unprecedented that it demanded immediate investigation. One of his sons had chosen redemption over damnation. The Emperor's golden features shifted, expressions flowing across his perfect face like light across water. Surprise gave way to wonder, wonder to a complex mixture of hope and sorrow that spoke to depths of emotion few would have suspected the master of mankind capable of experiencing. "My lord?" Malcador the Sigillite emerged from the shadows, where he had been maintaining his own vigil, his ancient face marked by the strain of weeks spent reinforcing Terra's psychic defenses. "The emanation from Lionsgate. You felt it too." The Emperor opened eyes that blazed with the light of stars and turned his attention to his oldest friend and advisor. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that existed in dimensions beyond normal human perception, each word weighted with the authority of someone who had guided humanity's development for millennia. "Mortarion has broken free," the Emperor said, the simple statement carrying implications that sent ripples through the chamber's carefully maintained psychic equilibrium. Through will alone, through the fundamental assertion of his right to choose his own path, he has severed his connection to chaos and begun the process of purification. Malcador leaned heavily on his staff, the implications of what his master was describing almost too vast to comprehend. Is such a thing even possible? Everything we know about corruption suggests that the touch of chaos is irreversible, that souls once claimed by the dark gods belong to them in perpetuity. "Everything we thought we knew," the Emperor corrected, rising from his position of meditation and moving to the chamber's primary scrying pool. The surface of the consecrated water shimmered with images of the battle raging across Terra's surface, but at its center, a point of pure light blazed with intensity that seemed to push back the surrounding darkness. But the universe, it seems, still has mysteries to reveal even to those who think they have plumbed its deepest secrets. Malcador approached the scrying pool with the careful steps of someone who understood that what they were witnessing represented a fundamental shift in the nature of reality itself. What does this mean for our strategy? For the siege? If one of the traitor Primarchs can simply choose redemption, what does that do to our assumptions about the enemy forces we're facing? "It means," the Emperor said quietly, his gaze never leaving the point of light that represented his redeemed son, "that the war we're fighting is more complex than either side fully understood. It means that the bonds chaos claims over mortal souls may not be as absolute as we feared. And it means that we face a choice that will determine not just the outcome of this siege, but the very nature of the galaxy we're fighting to preserve. Before Malcador could ask what choice his master meant, the chamber's security systems chimed softly, announcing the arrival of authorized personnel. Captain General Constantin Valdor entered with the precise movements of the Legio Custodes, his golden armor unmarked by the battles raging beyond the inner palace despite weeks of constant warfare. "My lord," Valdor's voice carried the professional calm of a warrior reporting tactical developments. "The emanation from Lion's Gate has been detected by psychic monitoring stations throughout the palace. Our astropaths are reporting unprecedented resonance patterns, and several have requested guidance on how to interpret what they're sensing." "They're sensing hope," the Emperor said, and the simple statement seemed to brighten the chamber's illumination. "For the first time in this war, they're sensing genuine hope that the darkness can be fought and defeated, not just endured or contained." Valdor's expression didn't change. The Captain General had long ago mastered the art of maintaining professional composure regardless of circumstances. But Malcador could see the subtle signs of a mind processing information that challenged fundamental assumptions. "What are your orders regarding Lion's Gate, my lord?" Valdor asked. "The tactical situation there remains fluid, with Death Guard forces in apparent disarray. Some of our field commanders are requesting permission to launch immediate assaults to exploit the confusion." "No." The Emperor's response was immediate and decisive. "Any conventional assault risks destroying exactly what we most need to preserve. If Mortarion has truly found his way back from the abyss, then he represents something far more valuable than a tactical victory." Malcador understood immediately. "You want to extract him, bring him back into the loyalist fold." "If possible," the Emperor confirmed. "But the situation is far too delicate for conventional military intervention. The corruption may be gone, but the trauma of its removal, the adjustment to his changed state, the simple shock of what he's accomplished, all of these factors make him incredibly vulnerable to being reclaimed by chaos if handled incorrectly." "Then what do you propose?" Valdor asked, though his tone suggested he had already guessed the answer. The Emperor was quiet for a long moment, his consciousness ranging out across the palace to touch the minds of his remaining loyal sons. Each carried their own burdens, their own wounds from the betrayals that had torn the legions apart. But one stood apart from the others, marked by a combination of nobility and empathy that made him uniquely suited for what needed to be done. "Sanguinius," the Emperor said finally. "He alone among my sons possesses the clarity of vision necessary to see past the corruption to the soul beneath. He can determine whether Mortarion's redemption is genuine or merely another trap laid by our enemies." Malcador nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom of the choice. Sanguinius had always been the most perceptive of the Primarchs when it came to matters of the soul, able to see past surface appearances to the fundamental nature of those he encountered. If anyone could assess the authenticity of Mortarion's transformation, it would be the Angel of Baal. "And if Lord Sanguinius determines the redemption is false?" Valdor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew this answer as well. "Then he ends Mortarion's suffering with the mercy that only a brother can provide," the Emperor replied. "But if it's genuine, if one of my fallen sons has truly found his way back to the light, then we have gained something far more precious than any military victory." The three figures stood in contemplative silence for several minutes, each processing the implications of what they were planning. The risks were enormous, sending Sanguinius into what was essentially enemy territory, based on nothing more than psychic emanations, and the unprecedented hope that redemption might be possible even for those who had fallen furthest from grace. But the potential rewards were even greater. If Mortarion could be successfully redeemed and reintegrated into the Loyalist cause, it would represent a psychological victory that could shake the entire traitor coalition to its foundations. More importantly, it would prove that the choices made in darkness could be unmade in light. That no soul was beyond salvation if it possessed the will to choose redemption. "I'll send word to Lord Sanguinius immediately," Valdor said, turning to leave the chamber. How much should he be told about the nature of his mission? "Everything," the Emperor said. "The truth of what Mortarion has accomplished, the implications for our understanding of corruption, the possibility that this could represent a turning point in our war against chaos itself. Sanguinius will need to understand the full scope of what he's being asked to assess." Valdor nodded and departed, leaving the Emperor and Malcador alone with their thoughts and the scrying pool that continued to show the point of light burning at the heart of Lionsgate Spaceport. "You realize," Malcador said quietly, "that if this goes wrong, if Mortarion's redemption is false, or if Sanguinius is somehow compromised in the attempt, we could lose one of our most crucial assets for the final phase of the siege." "I realize that," the Emperor acknowledged. "But I also realize that if we don't try, if we simply treat Mortarion as another enemy to be destroyed rather than a brother who might yet be saved, then we become exactly the kind of cold, calculating force that drove him to rebellion in the first place." The Sigillite considered this, weighing the emotional truth of his master's words against the harsh, mathematical realities of warfare. "You still love him. Despite everything he's done, despite the corruption he embraced, you still love him, as a father loves his son." "I love them all," the Emperor said simply, "even those who have fallen furthest from the light. Perhaps especially those, because they need that love most of all." The scrying pool pulsed with renewed intensity as the emanation from Lionsgate strengthened, as if responding to the Emperor's words. Whatever process Mortarion was undergoing, it was far from complete, but with each passing moment, the light seemed to grow stronger, more stable, more real. "Sanguinius will reach him," the Emperor said with quiet certainty. "And when he does, we'll finally learn whether redemption is truly possible for those who have walked in darkness, or whether hope itself is just another trap laid by our enemies." Malcador gripped his staff more tightly, feeling the weight of decisions that would shape the future of not just Terra, not just humanity, but potentially every soul in the galaxy that faced the choice between light and darkness. "And if redemption is possible?" he asked. The Emperor's smile was radiant with possibilities that stretched beyond the immediate concerns of the siege, beyond even the current war against chaos, to a future where the galaxy itself might yet be saved from the consuming darkness that threatened to devour it. "Then everything changes," he said. "Everything." In the depths of the Imperial Palace, surrounded by the artifacts and defenses of humanity's greatest civilization, two of the galaxy's most powerful beings prepared to gamble everything on the hope that love could triumph over corruption, that choice could overcome conditioning, and that even in the darkest hour, the light of redemption could still shine bright enough to guide the lost back home. The war for Terra continued to rage, but the war for the soul of humanity had just taken a turn that neither side had foreseen, and in the balance of that cosmic struggle, the fate of every being in the galaxy hung upon the choices of brothers who had been torn apart by betrayal, but might yet be reunited by grace. Sanguinius would fly to Lionsgate within the hour, carrying with him not just the hopes of the Loyalist cause, but the possibility that even the darkest night could give way to dawn if those trapped in its shadow possessed the courage to reach for the light. The question was whether that light would prove strong enough to overcome the forces of entropy and despair that had held sway for so long, or whether hope itself would be consumed by the very darkness it sought to illuminate. Only time would tell. But for the first time since the siege began, the Emperor dared to believe that the answer might surprise them all. Chapter 11. Blood Angel's Judgment. The sound reached them first, the distinctive harmonic of jump-pack engines operating in perfect synchronization, accompanied by the deeper rumble of gunship escorts. Khan looked up from the tactical displays he had been studying with Mortarion and felt something he hadn't experienced in months settle into his chest. Hope. Blood Angels, Mortarion said quietly, his enhanced hearing picking up the acoustic signatures with the same precision Khan's had. Sanguinius comes himself. Khan studied his brother's profile as Mortarion spoke, looking for any sign of the fear or resignation that might indicate deception in his redemption. Instead, he saw something he recognized from their days fighting together during the Great Crusade. Genuine anticipation at the prospect of seeing a beloved brother, tempered by the knowledge that this reunion would be unlike any they had shared before. "Are you ready for this?" Khan asked, though he wasn't entirely certain what this would entail. The Emperor's instructions had been clear enough. Sanguinius would assess the authenticity of Mortarion's transformation and make a determination about his future. What those instructions hadn't specified was what form that assessment might take, or what would happen if the Angel of Baal found the redemption wanting. "No," Mortarion answered with the stark honesty that had always marked his character. How could anyone be ready for something like this? I'm asking a brother I betrayed, who I fought against, who watched me fall to corruption and damnation, to believe that I've somehow found my way back. I'm asking him to trust that the man standing before him is genuinely redeemed rather than simply a more sophisticated form of deception. The sound of engines grew closer, accompanied now by the distinctive whistle of atmospheric entry. Through the command center's damaged windows, Khan could see the red and gold forms of Blood Angels descending toward Lionsgate Spaceport in tight combat formations. Their precision was absolute, their movements coordinated with the kind of perfection that only the most elite forces could achieve. But at the center of the formation, riding the thermals with wings spread wide and a grace that transcended mere tactical excellence, came Sanguinius himself. The Angel of Baal landed on the command center's primary platform with a gentleness that belied his massive frame, his wings folding against his back as he straightened to his full height. Even through the barriers of ceramite and reinforced glass that separated them, Khan could feel the psychic presence that had made Sanguinius legendary throughout the galaxy, not the overwhelming force that characterized the Emperor, but something subtler and more complex, a presence that seemed to see through surface appearances to the fundamental truth beneath. "My lord," came the voice of Captain Raldoran through the Vox system. "The spaceport's outer perimeter is secured, no sign of organized resistance from the Death Guard forces. Many appear to have abandoned their positions entirely." "Understood, Captain," Sanguinius replied, his voice carrying the same musical quality that had inspired loyalty from countless warriors across the stars. "Maintain perimeter security, but do not advance beyond the outer ring without my direct orders. What we face here is delicate." Khan activated the command center's external Vox system, opening a channel to the platform where his brother waited. "Sanguinius, it's good to see you again, brother, though I wish it were under better circumstances." The angel's perfect features shifted into an expression that mixed joy with profound sadness. Jagatai, the Emperor told me what you've been through, what you've accomplished here. I'm proud of you, brother, proud of the choice you made. The choice was Mortarion's, Khan replied, stepping aside to reveal the figure of their redeemed brother. I simply chose to honor it. Sanguinius's gaze fixed on Mortarion with an intensity that made the air itself seem to thicken with psychic potential. For a long moment, the angel said nothing, his consciousness ranging out to touch the edges of Mortarion's mind and soul with techniques that went far beyond normal psychic contact. Khan watched the process with fascination and growing concern. Sanguinius's eyes had taken on the golden radiance that marked the deepest use of his prescient abilities, and his expression was one of concentration so profound it seemed to shut out everything except the figure before him. I see you, brother, Sanguinius said finally, his voice carrying harmonics that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. I see what you were, what you became, and what you are now. I see the corruption that claimed you and the will that cast it aside. I see the pain of purification and the joy of freedom restored. Mortarion stood motionless under that cosmic scrutiny, submitting to an examination that penetrated deeper than any physical probe. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood that his entire future hung in the balance of this moment. What do you judge, Angel? Mortarion asked. Am I the brother you once knew, or simply another deception crafted by our enemies? Sanguinius was quiet for several more moments, his psychic senses probing every aspect of Mortarion's being, his thoughts, his memories, the fundamental structure of his soul. Khan could see the effort it was costing him, the strain of using abilities that allowed him to perceive truth with absolute clarity at the cost of experiencing all the pain and corruption that truth contained. When the angel finally spoke, his words carried a certainty that transcended mere opinion. You are my brother, Sanguinius said simply, changed by what you've endured, marked by the choices you made in darkness, but genuinely free of the corruption that claimed you. The redemption is real, Mortarion, as real as the love that brought you back from the abyss. Khan felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying drain from his shoulders. The validation meant everything, not just for the strategic implications, but for the simple human need to know that the choice he had made to trust his brother hadn't been a fool's gamble with consequences too terrible to contemplate. Then you accept me? Mortarion asked, and Khan could hear decades of shame and self-doubt compressed into those 4 words. I accept you, Sanguinius confirmed, stepping forward and extending his hand in the warrior's greeting they had shared countless times during the Great Crusade. Welcome back from the darkness, brother. We've missed you. The hand clasp that followed was more than a simple greeting. It was a recognition of brotherhood restored, of trust rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. Khan found himself thinking of Ulanor, of the unity they had shared when the galaxy seemed full of infinite possibility, and the bonds between the legions had seemed unbreakable. The Emperor wants you back, Sanguinius continued, his expression shifting to the focused intensity of a military commander processing strategic implications. But first, he wants to understand what happened here, what this means for our understanding of corruption and redemption. And he wants to know how we can use this development to maximum advantage against Horus. Mortarion nodded, his own strategic mind already working through the possibilities. Typhon is organizing the Nurgle loyal Death Guard into a coherent resistance force. They see my redemption as betrayal of their true oaths, and they're willing to fight their own gene brothers to prevent it from spreading. Which gives us an opportunity, Khan added, moving to the tactical displays that showed the current disposition of forces throughout Lion's Gate. The Death Guard are divided, leaderless, fighting among themselves. If we can exploit that division quickly enough, we can retake the spaceport and deliver a psychological blow to the entire traitor coalition. Sanguinius studied the displays with the keen eye of a warrior who had commanded some of the most complex military operations in Imperial history. The Blood Angels can secure the outer perimeter, but we'll need Death Guard forces to penetrate the inner defenses without massive casualties. Mortarion, how many of your sons can you trust to follow your lead, rather than Typhon's? Uncertain, Mortarion admitted. The purification process isn't uniform. Some are experiencing biological collapse. Others are finding balance between their corrupted and original natures. Still others are embracing the change completely and attempting their own redemption. It's chaos in every sense of the word. Then we make order from chaos, Sanguinius said, with the quiet confidence that had made him one of the most respected leaders in the galaxy. We use your personal authority to rally those who can be saved. We offer protection to those attempting their own purification, and we eliminate those who remain loyal to Nurgle with the mercy of quick deaths. Khan felt a familiar thrill as the three brothers began to work together on a tactical problem, their different perspectives and expertise combining into something greater than the sum of its parts. This was what the Great Crusade had felt like in its finest moments. Not just conquest, but liberation, not just victory, but the creation of something better than what had existed before. There's something else, Mortarion said, his expression troubled. The process that freed me from Nurgle's influence, it's not just about personal will or individual choice. There's a component that involves love, for lack of a better word. The connection between gene father and son, between brothers who refuse to abandon each other even in the darkest circumstances. Sanguinius and Khan exchanged glances, understanding immediately what their brother was suggesting. The redemption wasn't just a solo effort. It required the support and acceptance of those who still believed in the possibility of salvation, which means, Sanguinius said slowly, that we might be able to help others find their way back. If the corruption can be broken by love and will working together, then every redeemed traitor becomes a beacon for others who might be ready to make the same choice. The implications are staggering, Khan added. If this can be replicated, if redemption is genuinely possible for those who have fallen to chaos, then we're not just fighting to preserve what's left of the Imperium, we're fighting to reclaim what was lost. Mortarion looked at his two brothers, one who had chosen to protect him when execution would have been simpler, another who had validated his redemption when suspicion would have been safer, and felt something he had not experienced since before his fall to corruption. Belonging? Then let's begin, he said, moving toward the command center's communications array. I have a message to send to every Death Guard who can still hear their gene father's voice. Some will listen, some will refuse, and some will try to kill me for what I'm about to say. But all of them deserve the chance to choose. Sanguinius placed a hand on Mortarion's shoulder, the gesture carrying both support and determination. What will you tell them? The truth, Mortarion replied, activating the broad-spectrum Vox system that would carry his words to every Death Guard position across Terra. That redemption is possible, that the bonds of chaos are not unbreakable, and that their Primarch has found his way back to the light. Whether they follow me there or choose to remain in the darkness, that's a decision each of them will have to make for himself. Khan took position at the command center's tactical station, ready to coordinate the response to whatever chaos Mortarion's message might unleash. Whatever happens next, we face it together. Together, Sanguinius agreed, his wings spreading slightly as his prescient abilities touched the possible futures spreading out from this moment. And brother, Mortarion looked at him questioningly. Welcome home. The message began to broadcast across Terra's war-torn landscape, carrying with it the unprecedented news that one of the fallen had chosen to rise again. Some who heard it would respond with joy, others with rage, still others with desperate hope that they too might find a path back from the abyss. But all of them would be forced to confront the fundamental question that Mortarion's redemption represented, whether the choices made in darkness could be unmade in light, whether love could triumph over corruption, and whether the galaxy might yet be saved from the consuming shadow that threatened to devour it whole. The answer to those questions would be written in the blood and courage of brothers who had chosen to stand together against forces that sought to tear them apart, believing that even in the darkest hour, the light of hope could still shine bright enough to guide the lost back home. In the command center of Lionsgate Spaceport, 3 Primarchs prepared to change the course of history through the simple act of refusing to abandon each other to despair. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced every challenge during the golden age of their brotherhood, together, united, and determined to prove that love was stronger than hate, hope more enduring than despair, and redemption more powerful than the corruption that sought to claim every soul in the galaxy. The war for Terra was far from over, but the war for the soul of humanity had just taken a turn that would reshape the destiny of every being touched by the light of hope that still burned in the hearts of those brave enough to believe in the possibility of salvation. Chapter 12. The Pale Rider Reborn. The sight of Mortarion leading a charge against his own former forces was something that no warrior on either side of the siege of Terra had ever expected to witness. He moved across the battlefield with the methodical precision that had always marked Death Guard operations. But there was something different in his bearing now, a lightness that spoke to burdens cast aside, a clarity of purpose that came from choosing redemption over damnation. Behind him came 200 Death Guard who had answered his call, warriors who had undergone their own painful purifications and emerged ready to fight for something greater than the gifts of chaos. They were opposed by nearly 400 Death Guard who remained loyal to Typhon and Nurgle, but the numbers told only part of the story. The psychological impact of seeing their Gene father fighting against them was devastating to the Nurgle loyalists, sapping their morale and creating hesitation where once there had been only grim determination. "Target the heavy weapons emplacements," Mortarion commanded over the tactical channel, his voice carrying the authority that had led the 14th Legion through countless campaigns. "Remember, these are our brothers who have chosen a different path. Grant them the mercy of clean deaths when possible." Captain Morvain, one of the first Death Guard to successfully undergo purification, acknowledged the order and began directing his squad toward a fortified position where Loyalist forces had established overlapping fields of fire. His movements were fluid, controlled, showing none of the shambling gait that had characterized the most corrupted Death Guard. Khan watched the battle unfold from his position alongside Sanguinius, both Primarchs coordinating the broader assault that would finally retake Lionsgate Spaceport. The White Scars had taken the northern approaches, while the Blood Angels secured the eastern sectors, but it was Mortarion's forces that were making the crucial difference in penetrating the inner defenses. "He knows their tactics better than anyone," Sanguinius observed, tracking Mortarion's movements through tactical displays that showed the ebb and flow of battle. Every defensive position, every fallback route, every contingency plan, he helped design all of it. More than that, Khan replied, watching as one of Mortarion's squads bypassed a seemingly impregnable strong point by using maintenance tunnels that didn't appear on any standard schematic. He's showing them that redemption is possible. Every loyalist Death Guard who sees him fighting beside us instead of against us is going to start questioning their own choices. The psychological warfare aspect was indeed proving as important as the tactical advantages. Reports were coming in from across the siege lines of Death Guard units abandoning their positions, not in retreat, but in confusion. Some were attempting to reach Lion's Gate, hoping to undergo their own purification processes. Others were simply laying down their weapons, no longer certain what they were fighting for. But perhaps most significantly, the effect was beginning to spread beyond the Death Guard themselves. Word of Mortarion's redemption was carrying through the traitor forces like wildfire, creating doubt and uncertainty, where once there had been grim certainty. In the depths of Lion's Gate spaceport, Typhon stood amid the ruins of his command post and felt something he had not experienced since his transformation into Typhus, genuine fear. Not fear of death, which had lost all meaning when he embraced Nurgle's gifts, but fear of irrelevance, fear that everything he had sacrificed, everything he had become, might have been for nothing if redemption was truly possible. "My lord," Captain Vorlex approached with the careful steps of a warrior, delivering unwelcome news. "The outer ring has fallen. Mortarion's forces have broken through the primary defensive line and are advancing on our position." Typhon turned from the tactical display that showed the systematic collapse of his defenses, his diseased features twisting into an expression of rage and despair. "How many have we lost to purification?" "Difficult to say, my lord. Perhaps a third of our remaining forces have simply ceased fighting. They're not dead. Our biomonitors still show active life signs, but they're not responding to orders either." The implications were staggering. A third of his force had essentially been neutralized not by enemy action, but by the simple example of their gene father choosing a different path. It was psychological warfare on a scale that Typhon had never encountered, and he had no tactical doctrine for countering it. "Gather the most, faithful," Typhon commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who refused to accept defeat even when facing the impossible. "Those whose corruption runs too deep for redemption, whose oaths to Grandfather Nurgle are stronger than their genetic loyalty. We make our stand in the central core." Vorlex nodded and moved to carry out the orders, but Typhon could see the doubt in his movements. Even his most trusted captains were beginning to question whether they were fighting for something worthy of their sacrifice, or simply prolonging an inevitable defeat. As the sounds of approaching battle grew louder, Typhon found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. The embrace of corruption, the rejection of weakness, the absolute certainty that strength could only come through surrender to powers greater than mortal will. Had all of that been wrong? Had there been another path, one that led to strength without corruption, power without damnation? The questions tormented him more than any physical wound could have, because they suggested that his greatest victory, his transformation into Typhus, herald of Nurgle, might have been his greatest failure. Mortarion paused at the entrance to the spaceport's central core, his enhanced senses detecting the familiar psychic signature of his former first captain waiting beyond the reinforced barriers. For a moment, he was transported back to the early days of the Death Guard, when Callus Typhon had been one of his most trusted advisors, a warrior whose strategic brilliance and unwavering loyalty had made him invaluable during the Great Crusade. The man who waited beyond those barriers bore the same genetic pattern, the same core personality. But something essential had been lost in the transformation to typhus. "Brother Captain Morvain," Mortarion spoke quietly into his vox system. "Hold your position here. What lies ahead is something I must face alone." "My lord," Morvain's voice carried concern mixed with determination. "The tactical situation suggests overwhelming force would be more effective than individual heroics." "This isn't about tactics," Mortarion replied, checking his weapons one final time. "This is about a father, trying to save a son who may be beyond salvation." He advanced through the barriers alone, his footsteps echoing in the corrupted corridors of what had once been his command center. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with malevolent life, covered in growths that spoke to months of unchecked corruption under Typhon's leadership. The central chamber opened before him like a diseased cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadows that moved with their own agenda. At its heart stood Typhon, transformed beyond easy recognition, but still unmistakably the warrior Mortarion had known for over 2 centuries. "Father," Typhon's voice carried harmonics that belonged to no human throat, "you've come to witness the final victory of truth over delusion. I've come to offer you the same choice I was offered," Mortarion replied, raising his weapon but not yet moving to attack. "The chance to choose redemption over damnation, freedom over slavery." Typhon's laughter was the sound of diseased lungs struggling with corrupted air. "Freedom? You call this freedom? You've traded the power of a god for the weakness of mortality, the certainty of purpose for the confusion of choice. What you call redemption, I call surrender." "Then you haven't understood what redemption truly costs," Mortarion said, beginning to circle his former first captain with the careful movements of a predator assessing its prey. "It doesn't come from surrender. It comes from the strength to reject what seems like strength, to choose hope over certainty, love over power." The battle that followed was brief but intense, 2 enhanced warriors testing the limits of their capabilities in a space too small to contain their fury. Typhon fought with the supernatural endurance that Nurgle's gifts provided, but Mortarion fought with something else, the clarity of purpose that came from choosing light over darkness. In the end, it was not superior skill or greater strength that decided the outcome, but the fundamental difference in what they were fighting for. Typhon fought to preserve what he had gained through corruption. Mortarion fought to prove that something better was possible. When Typhon fell, his last words were not curses or threats, but a question that would haunt Mortarion for years to come. Was it worth it? Was redemption worth the price you paid? The retaking of Lion's Gate spaceport was complete by nightfall, but the implications of what had been accomplished there would ripple outward for decades to come. Across Terra, reports filtered in of Death Guard units laying down their weapons, of traitor forces abandoning positions as word of Mortarion's redemption spread through their ranks. The psychological impact was beginning to affect other legions as well. If a demon Primarch could choose redemption, what did that mean for warriors who had made similar choices but not yet fallen so far? In the Imperial Palace, the Emperor felt the change like a shift in the fundamental structure of reality itself. The light burning at Lion's Gate had grown stronger, more stable, and it was beginning to kindle similar lights throughout the siege lines as other warriors found the courage to choose hope over despair. "The tide is turning," Malcador observed, studying reports that showed the first coordinated traitor withdrawals since the siege began. Not just tactically, but spiritually. Mortarion's example is giving others the strength to question their own choices. The Emperor nodded, his consciousness ranging out across Terra to touch the minds of loyal and traitor forces alike. What he found there gave him more hope than any military victory could have provided. The growing recognition that the choices made in darkness could be unmade in light, that redemption was possible for any soul willing to pay its price. "Send word to Guilliman and the Lion," the Emperor commanded. "Tell them that when they arrive, they may find a very different siege than the one they left. Tell them that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through the courage to offer salvation to those who believe they are beyond saving." In the command center of Lionsgate Spaceport, now flying Imperial colors for the first time since the siege began, Mortarion stood with his brothers and contemplated the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The immediate tactical victory was significant, but the strategic implications were staggering. They had proven that the hold of chaos over corrupted souls was not absolute, that redemption was possible even for those who had fallen furthest from grace. More importantly, they had demonstrated that brotherhood could triumph over corruption, that love could overcome hate, and that hope was stronger than despair. "What happens now?" Khan asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would be complex. "Now we find out if what happened here can be replicated," Sanguinius replied, his prescient abilities touching the edges of possible futures that branched out from this moment. If other fallen warriors can find their way back to the light, if redemption can become not just an individual miracle, but a force that reshapes the galaxy itself. Mortarion looked out at the scarred landscape of Terra, where the war for humanity's future continued to rage, and felt something he had not experienced since before his fall: genuine hope for the future. "Then we have work to do," he said simply. "All of us. Because if redemption is truly possible, then we have a responsibility to offer it to every soul willing to choose light over darkness." The war was far from over, but for the first time since the heresy began, victory seemed possible. Not just the preservation of what remained, but the reclamation of what had been lost. In the ruins of a galaxy torn apart by civil war, three brothers stood together and prepared to prove that even in the darkest hour, the light of hope could still shine bright enough to guide the lost back home. The Pale Rider had been reborn, and with him, the possibility that redemption itself might prove to be the greatest weapon in the arsenal of those who fought for something greater than themselves. The siege would continue, but its nature had fundamentally changed. For now it was not just a war between loyalist and traitor, but a struggle between those who believed in the possibility of salvation and those who had surrendered to the certainty of damnation. And in that struggle, for the first time since the darkness began, the light seemed poised to win. The galaxy held its breath and waited to see if hope would prove stronger than despair, if love would triumph over hatred, and if the choices made in darkness could truly be unmade by those brave enough to reach for the light. The answer would be written in the courage of brothers who refused to abandon each other to the abyss, who chose to believe that redemption was possible even when all evidence suggested otherwise, and who proved that sometimes the greatest victories were won not through destruction, but through the simple act of refusing to give up on those who had given up on themselves. Mortarion, the Pale Rider, had found his way back from the darkness. Whether others would follow remained to be seen, but for the first time in decades, the galaxy dared to hope that the answer might be yes.